This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Hi, my name's Chris Owens. I played Jeffrey Spender on The X-Files, and I'm happy to be talking on the X-Cast.
And welcome back to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Tony Black, and this is the end. I never thought I'd hear myself say this after all these years. Actually, that's the wrong episode. I flashed forward to season 6, Darren. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be joined to talk the season 5 finale and wrap up our season 5 coverage, talking about the end with who else? It has to be Darren Mooney. How you doing, Darren?
That's grand. I'm just really excited I managed to single-handedly force X-Cast production to move to Los Angeles so I could fulfill my dreams. Really proud that I finally managed to accomplish that after 5 seasons of the show.
Yeah, I think, it has almost been 5 years, and you've been guesting on the X-Cast for 4 of those. So, over the years, you've progressively sowed the seeds for the big move that's going to happen.
And I mean, finally moving over there, I feel like I'm willing to sign a contract extension for 2 whole seasons, which is grand. And I'm sure we'll figure out what happens after that.
Oh, yeah, of course. Fine. Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. But yeah, this is us wrapping up our season 5 coverage with the end. And fittingly, there is going to be an announcement at the end of this episode, which I'm going to leave people cliffhangered, not quite in the same sense as a burning office building.
Tony, I was going to say, you do realise they can just skip forward to the end of the podcast.
What?
Right? They can just scroll across on the little kind of finger dial, right?
They do not have this technology, Darren. I don't believe you. Well, if you want to stay in suspense, and the X-Files is very good at suspense, guys. If you want to maintain suspense for however long we record and wait for this mysterious announcement till the end, I encourage you to do so. But if you really can't wait, if you want some spoilers, then yeah, by all means do Darren's futuristic technology idea there. Go for it. But until then, we'll talk about the end, which is the 20th and final episode of the X-Files for season 5. The 117th overall, which first aired on May the 17th, 1998, was written by, who else? Chris Carter, and directed by R.W. Goodwin. The final episode directed by R.W. Goodwin, and the final episode filmed in Vancouver before, as we've joked, the show moves to Los Angeles. In this episode, Mulder and Scully end up on the hunt for an assassin who attempted to kill a young boy called Gibson Praise, who was there when a chess genius was assassinated during a chess match, although Mulder soon realises that the chess genius wasn't the target, it was actually Gibson, who may be the key to the X-Files himself. So Darren, this is, we've done a few season finales together. This is a big one, I think, even in the scope of the X-Files. So let's do our usual. What would you give the end out of 10?
This is an interesting one because it's probably one of my least favourite X-Files season finales. It's certainly my least favourite up until this point. It might even be, and I'm really sorry to say this, it might even be my second least favourite overall in the entire run of the show. And I think so, and having given it that build-up, which sounds like I'm going to give it quite a kicking over the next however long this episode lasts, I am still quite fond of it. There's a lot to like in here. I think that it has some good material. It's got a lot of rich atmosphere. It really kind of soaks up that Vancouver kind of element of it. It really, even shots of people meeting at the underpass, the lighting in those shots is striking. It kind of hits a lot of the core beats of the X-Files. It's got this kind of wonderful atmosphere that runs through it from that introductory sequence with Skinner where he's like, "What do you want?" in the end, which is the episode that we're filming right now. But it more generally speaking, it does have a sense of kind of closure, right down to things like, say, using Vancouver as itself at one point in the film, as one point in the episode, despite it making next to no sense in terms of logic, jurisdiction, and actual plot mechanics. So I do like it a great deal, even if I think that it has some very serious problems, and I think that it's one of those rare episodes of mythology, at least to this point, where its charms aren't enough to get past some basic logistical kind of internal logic problems for me. So I would give it a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, okay. I think I would go for maybe a 7.5, simply because I think I get completely where you're coming from, and I think if you look at it from, it doesn't feel that long ago since we talked about Gethsemane, and that is a stronger piece of work as an actual contained episode, which leaves the door open for lots of other storylines and tees up a really interesting season 5 opener. But the end has to sort of function on various different levels, doesn't it? It's being filmed in after the Fight the Future, the movie, has been filmed, so that season 5, as we've talked about a lot this season, is leading towards a point that they know about. So there are certain things that have to happen before that movie. So the X-Files has to be closed down. Well, The Office doesn't have to burn down.
Cigarette smoking man has to be back.
The cigarette smoking man has to be back, all of these things.
But it also then at the same time is kind of simultaneously setting up elements in the 6th season that Carter hadn't thought about when he was writing Fight the Future.
Yeah.
So you have elements like, say, Foley, for example, and Spender, who are completely absent from the film, despite the fact their presence would seem to be important. Gibson Praise is introduced here and goes on to be quite important to the 6th season premiere and later on in the show, but it was, again, completely absent and not even referenced in Fight the Future, I imagine, because Carter hadn't thought of him existing at that point in the run. You have things like, say, Krychek, who is his hero as the well-manicured man's driver, despite the fact that, in the feature film, the well-manicured man has a different driver, and that's important for plot functions because we don't want to leave Nicholas Lee unemployed. Spoiler alert for Fight the Future. But, I mean, you can see that there is that kind of push and pull that's happening with it at the same time, and even things like that move that we've mentioned from Vancouver to Los Angeles, which is something that apparently happened relatively late in the process, because this is the thing with the end. The end was originally kind of, this is the point where I think Carter had wanted the show to end, so to speak. Because Carter did a lot of interviews around the time the show started, and he was talking about, what is where does he see the show going? And he was like, I see it going for 5 years, and then maybe transitioning into a series of feature films. That's 100 episodes, at 20 episodes a year. It's 117, actually, is where we are now. But the idea is that after that, you could sell it into syndication. If you sell it into syndication, it becomes profitable for the production company. It means that people can make a living off it after the fact. It can possibly retire on it, and it means that Carter can move on to doing another thing. But what happened is the show became so successful that it became a victim of its own success, and you start seeing this with lots of shows. This is why 7 seasons tends to be the length of time that a show runs for, because 5 seasons are the initial agreement, the initial contracts that you have, and that gets you to syndication. But if the show is so successful, what typically happens is the network will bring people back to the table, offer them huge sums of money to do 2 more seasons. And that's the point at which people actually make real money off filming the show. And you'll notice that the actors get huge pay rises. In fact, Duchovny and Anderson both got huge pay rises as well when they went into the final or the next 2 seasons of the show as well. But you have this kind of push and pull where Carter clearly originally wanted the X-Files to end after 5 years, was told by Fox that no, it wouldn't. In fact, he's done interviews with the AV Club where he was told by Fox if he didn't keep it running, they would bring in somebody else who would, and Carter basically stayed out of a sense of obligation because he felt like he owed that to Anderson and to Duchovny. At the same time, Carter also had his hands forced by Duchovny, who had according to reading interviews with Duchovny, he had always expected the show to move to Los Angeles. It had been kind of an understanding on his part that the show either wouldn't last long or after about 3 years would move to Los Angeles, and that never quite materialized. Duchovny perhaps generated some tension in Vancouver by giving interviews where he talked about how it rained all the time there and how much he didn't enjoy certain aspects of filming there. And again, people like, say, Nick Lee have talked about how, there's a tendency to vilify Duchovny for this, because this is a man who was away from his family, who was away from where he lived, who was away and kind of thrown into this environment and committed to, again, the shooting schedule on a show that runs 20 episodes a year, 24 episodes a year at its peak, is exhausting and emotionally draining. And again, people like, you hear accounts of, say, Duchovny and Anderson not getting on while filming, and again, a sense of maybe them not being professional to one another, or maybe one of them being less professional to the other than, they really should be. But at the same time, I tend to have sympathy because I understand that when you're making a show like that, it is draining and exhausting. The working hours involved are kind of killer. And for actors in particular, where your appearance and your age and your vitality are kind of huge selling points for you, where if you're committed to doing a show in Vancouver for 7 years, it means actively missing out on doing other things that are potentially more profitable or more fulfilling for yourself, or just better kind of opportunities in terms of going where you want to go. So, like, I completely understand Duchovny's discomfort with being in Vancouver. And I think that people on the production who have talked about it have been quite level-headed. People like Nick Lee have said, look, I live in Canada. I like shooting in Canada. But for somebody who moved to Canada from Los Angeles, it is something that is draining. So Duchovny said, basically, if you want me in a 6th season, you are going to have to move the production to Los Angeles. And there's a sense of the show maybe not being entirely comfortable with that move. And you can see that when you get to the 6th season. You'll be talking about a lot, I suspect, when we talk about stuff like the beginning, but even episodes like, obviously, Drive and Triangle, or even like The Rain King, where the entire mood of the show seems to change as a result. But you can see it even here in the end, where there's a sense of trepidation, where, you know, the burning down of the office at the end of the episode is a way for Carter, in just purely pragmatic terms, to draw a line under the Vancouver years, but also in practical terms to disguise the fact that they're going to have to build a new set of the office down in Los Angeles on the 20th Century Fox lot. And when they build that set down there, no matter how perfect they make it look, no matter how wonderful a facsimile it is, it's never going to look exactly like the set they have in Vancouver. So burning it down is a practical way of explaining any of the differences between the two versions of the set and kind of drawing a line between them. And there is that kind of aspect that runs through it. There's a sense of the end, like, I appreciate that the end has to do a lot of things. It has to connect a lot of dots. And I respect it for that. And I think it does it relatively well. But I still think that there's a point at which it's so fixated on doing that its kind of narrative isn't as engaging as it might be otherwise. And again, you know, critiquing the internal story logic of the X-Files is a fun game to play. And I mean, seriously, like, we talked about, like, was a shit Excalibur in, like, Talitha Kumi, which is, like, one of the great examples of the X-Files being like, well, we need a plot device, so we'll figure it out. We'll throw in a stiletto and we'll figure it out before we start shooting, and then never get round to doing something more impressive. But generally, the show is kind of fast enough or nimble enough on its feet to get around that. I think for me, the problem with the end is that it's doing so much of this plate spinning and plate moving and kind of like sleight of hand stuff that the actual stuff that it's doing to distract from that isn't as elegant as some of the show's best episodes, at least for me.
You've summarised that brilliantly there, and I think it is more of a functional season finale than some of the others have been in the past that have been quite innovative or creative or striking. And we've talked about all of them in the past, and I think that the end is more of a means to an end. You know, while. And there is the irony of that title in many different ways. You know, as you say, it's the end of Vancouver, but it's not the end of the show. You know, it is, and that's why the cheekiness of season 6's premiere being called the beginning, because it almost feels like a demarcation line. You know, this is the end of this era, and the beginning is the beginning of that era. So, on that sense, it is like a real line in the sand with Fight the Future as the bridge. And it can't operate, therefore, necessarily as something as dynamic or fascinating, as dynamic as, say, Anasazi, or as fascinating and thematic as Gethsemane. I suppose it's probably its closest bedfellow in some ways would be Talitha Kumi, although Talitha Kumi, not in story terms, but in the sense of it being not necessarily as weighty, you know, or as powerful. Although, obviously, with Talitha Kumi, it's got a storyline that continues on directly, and the end isn't that kind of cliffhanger. You know, it's more, I suppose, in that sense, the clearest parallel would be the Erlenmeyer Flask, because the Erlenmeyer Flask ends with the X-Files closed. It ends with the door open for something else, and then season 2 picks up at a later point. It's like a second pilot. But that's the thing. The beginning isn't like a second pilot. The beginning's almost like part 2 of a story that's had a massive movie wedged in the middle. So
that's exactly. It's like a weird like part 2.5 almost. It's like Fight the Future is part 2 and the beginning is part 2.5. Like and again, like part of me admires, and I talked about this when I talked with kind of Kurt about the we talked about the the Patient X and the Red and the Black, and like one of the things that I actually genuinely admire about the second half of the 5th season, kind of the last stretch of mythology episodes, is the way in which you can tell that Carter has to thread that needle. He's got like the needle hole that he's already kind of lined up basically as a result of having like written Fight the Future during the 4th season, having shot it in the gap between the 4th and 5th seasons, and having written the 5th season after Fight the Future, and so knowing that he needs to line it all up. And there's a sense, in the first half of the season of him being very kind of like careful and restrained and very kind of like stoic, and you end up with things like, say, A Christmas Carol is an episode I like, Emily is an episode I loathe, but you end up with a two-parter that's about treading water. Whereas in the second half of the season, there's a real sense of like Carter going, actually, I've had a wave of good ideas. Now, whether those good ideas are driven by the move to Los Angeles, which wasn't really on the table when we made the movie, for example, or the fact that, I know that there's tension with, say, Duchovny over the direction of the show, and therefore I have to, like, accommodate that, and whether or not, the kind of, you can see two fathers and one son kind of lining up in the distance. And the thing about the end, which I really admire, and I actually genuinely admire this, as much as, again, it sounds like I'm going to give the episode a kicking, and trust me, I will at certain points, but the thing I really, really admire about it is the fact that it ramps up to both of those. It ramps up to two fathers and one son, which is clearly an idea that Carter hadn't formulated clearly in his head when he wrote Fight the Future, but it also at the same time ramps up to Fight the Future itself. And it manages to serve both of those two masters in a way that, isn't elegant, but was never going to be elegant, but is nonetheless committed and efficient, is the best thing about it. It somehow works. And again, like, not to get too spoilery, I hope I might be back to talk about the beginning of the start of the 6th season, but I really, really, really like the beginning. And I admire the end for being willing to serve those two masters, to be two things to two very different episodes that follow it. And I think that's an incredible task to ask of an episode of television. And I think the fact that it pulls it off is a huge mark in its favor. Darren says, meaning that now I can go to town on the episode.
Well, the question is, does everyone agree with you, or have they all gone to town with it? And the best way to find out is through IMDb, as ever. So this has had 2,558 votes. Why don't you have a little guess, Darren, at what this might have got on IMDb?
I feel like I should retire because I think I got like Patient X and the Red and the Black pretty spot on.
Yeah.
And I feel like I should just like throw my hands up in the air and say retire while I'm ahead. Okay, so can you kind of cheat and can you tell me what the Red and the Black got?
Okay, so the Red and the Black got 8.6.
I'm going to go with 8.8.
You are not far off. You're not far off. You're not quite right, but you're not far off. It actually got a 9.0.
Whoa!
So the end is up there with the top-rated episode of the season, which is Bad Blood at 9.4. Behind that is Redux 2 at 9.2. And then in third place, you have The End at 9.0.
I don't think I want to live in this world anymore, Tony.
Well, I mean, considering that, and we will talk a little bit about season 5 generally, and we're gonna find out what everyone else has thought and get some thoughts on what they think about the season as the whole, as well as this episode in the mailbag. But I do like The End, but I don't know if it's the third best episode of season 5, Darren. I'm not sure it's going to make my top 3 list. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, spoiler alert for the rest of the season. It is very safely not going to make my top 3. And I'm glad people enjoy it in the way that they do. And I think, like, I'm actually really fond of the 5th season as a whole. And I feel like it's strange to me that you look at those 20 episodes that include, like, I'm struggling to reduce my kind of list down to 3 episodes I love. And like part of me is like, I really want to put something trollish on there. I want to be like, no. I mean, I want to put the evil computer episode on there. I want to put sort of like Kill Switch on there. Or I want to be really cheeky and do something like put on Mind's Eye on there, so like, or Folie à Deux. And it's like, no, somebody put The End on there. Like collectively, we as like a group of X-Files fan, we're like, nope, The End is the third best episode of the season. Which is more power to it. It's good to be an outlier. I'm being iconoclastic, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's obviously done well. I think probably it's because of some of the things we've talked about. The fact it has quite these big moments in there. It's a memorable episode for several reasons, and obviously it's the one before Fight the Future. So I think there's a lot of reasons why maybe it's well remembered and well liked by people. But yeah, it's interesting placement. So we'll find out what people think about the end later on, as I say. So should we delve in and discuss the episode and allow you to let rip at points?
I feel like the ends justify the means, Tony.
So the end begins, as we've said, in Vancouver, in British Columbia, which is the first time that the X-Files actually gone to Vancouver, which is a nice tip of the hat to the location of the show, definitely. And it's one of those in-jokes that I think a lot of people, I don't know if necessarily that just casual viewers will get that, but I think the fans will get it. The fans will understand that it's paying some homage. And, by this point, I mean, do you remember? I can't remember, Darren, but at this point, did fans know that the move was happening by the time this aired in May 97? Were they aware that Vancouver was over at this point?
Well, there were various rumours and speculation, I believe. And again, keep in mind that I'm willing to concede I may not be the best authority on this. But going back to, say, October 1997, Duchovny had signalled that he believed that production was going to kind of be moving south of the border, or south of the Canadian border, as it were. You had then basically makeup artist Tony Lindala suggesting around the same time that a move was highly unlikely. Sources then suggested that the move was basically a done deal in January 1998, and it was officially confirmed at the end of March. So it probably would have been well known by the time even that they were shooting this. And it's actually notable that while they were shooting it, that sequence in that giant stadium for the chess match, they actually hosted that for local fans in Vancouver, which is a really sweet gesture. The stadium had a capacity of 5,000 people. 12,000 people allegedly showed up to be part of that sequence, which is amazing. Between takes, Anderson and Duchovny would actually answer questions from the audience about working on the show, and there were apparently raffles of thousands of dollars worth of props and equipment from the show, basically given away to kind of spectators and fans as a kind of a thank you gesture to the city for hosting them. Carter himself, I believe, worked as second unit photographer on the episode as well, as kind of his way of saying goodbye to Vancouver, which had been such a huge part of the show. And there's something very sweet in that, something like genuinely sweet in that, I think.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so there's lots of little ways. I said 97 earlier. I meant 98 there, actually, because I don't think they realised this was happening in 97. I think that was a bit too early.
Duchovny was probably expecting it to happen sometime around 97.
Yeah, maybe. But yeah, obviously in this arena you have the chess match, the international chess match between Gibson Praise, as we've said, and Anatol Klebanov, a Russian grandmaster, and this young prodigy. And Anatol Klebanov gets shot, but Gibson, we know something's up with Gibson because he's getting the voices, the psychic voices, and he knows this assassin is there. And I mean, I like this opening. I think it's a good, teaser. I don't know about you, Darren, as a child of the 90s. As soon as I saw that assassin, I was just in a Jurassic Park all over again.
Yes, exactly, Jurassic Park. It's the creepy lawyer from Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
And you look at his filmography and he's done lots of stuff, and you kind of wonder, is it like a bane on him to be known as the guy who gets eaten on the toilet in Jurassic Park? Like, that his one claim to fame, despite a career that stretches over decades, is he's most likely to be recognised as, hey, you're the guy from the toilet in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
But my mind went exactly the same place.
Yeah, even Wikipedia backs us up, though. Martin Ferrero, his name is, and the very first line is he's an American actor. His most well-known role is Donald Gennaro in the 93 film Jurassic Park. So the man is condemned to being, the slimy lawyer who gets eaten on the bog, basically. But you know what? There are worse ways. There are worse ways in film and worse films to go, I think. If you're going to be remembered for any movie, get remembered for Jurassic Park. You know, I could live with that.
It's one of the great kills in Jurassic Park as
Yeah.
well. Like, there's a reason we don't just remember the slimy lawyer character. We remember exactly how he dies,
Right.
because it's one of the great movie deaths.
Definitely. It's brilliant. So yeah, he's the assassin in that. That got me excited as a as a teenager, and that's the opening. It's like I say, it's a good opening, and then in the credits we get the truth is out there changed to the end, just to spell it out. Although I don't know, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I always thought that would have been, if they'd have done the X-Files in more of a traditional style in some ways, that would have been a good place to put the episode title every week, don't you? Don't you think? Instead of the slogan, you could have had the episode title there, and it would have worked for me.
You could indeed. And again, part of me wonders if this was one of those kind of budget things where, because, 90s television production, the way that the title was kind of set, it probably cost a great deal of money to change that in the occasions that they did, as opposed to now where everything's all digitized and you just change a text input somewhere. So part of me wonders if, maybe these days you'd be more likely to see something like that. Because, most TV shows have, just put the title over the opening kind of sequence, post-credits, in the top left-hand corner of the screen.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah, you might be right. But then after the credits, it's action territory, because we're back in the Canadian wilderness, and we're back at the Smoking Man's shack, which we saw at the end of The Red and the Black, which you talked about, as you said, with Kurt, and none other than Alex Krycek, fresh off the Russian boat, parachutes in with a red shirt. He might as well be a red shirt from Star Trek, this guy, mightn't he? Because he just gets shot dead, basically, as soon as he lands. And they're there to seemingly kill the Smoking Man. I think this is a great scene. And already, in these two scenes, I feel like... I've always felt like the music is different in this episode. That Mark Snow's score... and maybe it's some elements of the Fight the Future score that he was either working on at this point or he'd finished. Because I think Fight the Future drops like a month after the end he's aired on television. So he's more than likely done the score for that, or he's nearly finished it. So I feel like there are certain strains from some of that more orchestral stuff in there. And both of these scenes have that, I think, quite ominous musical pallor laid over them.
They don't, and they also have a sense of spectacle as well, which is very much in keeping with Fight the Future, which is the X-Files as a summer blockbuster. I mean, what we'll be talking about at the end of the episode, I suspect, may involve how you're going to talk about Fight the Future. But Fight the Future is a big blockbuster. And like one of the things that's quite impressive about the end, the X-Files always managed to do, blockbuster storytelling on a TV budget. Most obviously, for example, the Runaway Train in Nicene 731, which is basically like Speed but on a train. But I mean, even things like, for example, here you have that sequence with the kind of chess match, but you have huge crowds in a stadium, which look like, they are contest winners, and it's a very savvy move of Carter to find a way to kind of to bring in the fans and make them part of the show, while also using that to give a sense of scale and spectacle. But it's a full stadium populated by people, not CGI, not a matte painting, not a couple of close-ups, not some stock footage. It's like actual shots where you can have Gibson craze and you can have the chessboard in the same shot as lots of people, and have the assassin up on the rafters with the crowd visible below him, which gives you a real sense of this is a proper scale of production. And similarly, like, you could open after the credits with like Alex Krycek parachutes into the wilderness and hunts the cigarette smoking man like he's the most dangerous game, while the cigarette smoking man kind of improvises kind of a response out of it. It does really give the sense of propulsive kind of quality to it, and I think the soundtrack kind of is part of that. It kind of creates a sense of you're watching almost like a 45-minute trailer for a blockbuster that you're going to see this summer, which is quite impressive from a logistical point of view. Yeah.
It does feel slightly different. It does feel a bit more action orientated, and it's the kind of thing I feel like the show can only get away with at this point. It's again tapping into that idea that it is quite an ensemble at this point. A lot of these characters are still alive. The conspiracy is still alive and well, and there are a fair few scenes in this episode that don't feature Mulder and Scully at all. And this episode has the majority, I think, of the main, recurring characters in there. Even if it's just for one scene, this is packed. There are certain mythology episodes that will leave certain people out, but this has got all of them.
And it brings, like, it's so stuffed that Krychek is basically relegated to being a chauffeur. Like that, like, we're so eager to bring everybody in that, like, we can't necessarily have, like, Krychek gets a little action beat at the start, but, like, he's hanging around. Nicholas Lee's hanging around. We like him a great deal. So let's just make him the well-manicured man's driver for some reason, because it gives us an excuse to have more Krychek scenes and to have a couple more Krychek lines. Like, you know, that wonderful, I have a great shot at him, and the moment where you're wondering if he's going to mow down the cigarette smoking man in a car park. But again, like, and again, it's very much kind of a love letter to, you can tell the show is very much at a stage where it's like, can you believe that this has been as successful as it is? Let's have a giant party to celebrate it. And the giant party is for the fans of the stadium. It's also for all the actors and the cast and the crew and for everybody involved, who has kind of made the show what it is. You know, there is a celebratory atmosphere there, very much, which is ironic given how the episode ends with that very funereal kind of closing shot. But throughout, there's a real sense of, we've done it, we did it, we got 100 plus episodes, we did 5 seasons, can you believe that we've done it, we all did it, which I really like about it.
And it's almost like it never quite does this again, actually. If you think about the future seasons to come, where, you know, half the characters in this episode are dead within a season, basically. The rest are then trickled through. You know, you don't see Krychek or the Smoking Man a great deal across, certainly from mid-season 6 through to the start of season 8. You know, well, actually, no, the end of season 8, because, you know, obviously the Smoking Man's not in season 8, but you don't see a lot of them, really, in that time. And it really does sort of sparse that out. So the end is the last, probably the last mythology episode that, like you say, has this celebratory, let's get everyone in. Maybe the only one that comes close to that is Requiem, where you have that brilliant scene in the
Last Supper scene room, where they're planning
the Last Supper scene, with everyone together, and that's probably the closest you get to this again. So, and that never really struck me before. Talking about it in that way, that this does have everyone in there, and it is. I loved this era of the show. I loved it when you had all these different characters, all these different threads, and there were times when it's funny because at the time I always remember when I was watching it back then, I used to love seeing all of the recurring characters almost as much as I used to enjoy Mulder and Scully. And I think the older I've got now, the more I appreciate the standalones where it's just Mulder and Scully and they're off somewhere and something's happening. And I really appreciate those two together. And obviously I appreciated it even more once the end of season 7 came. And much as I really love John Doggett, don't get me wrong, I do. You know, you was always that yearning to get back a little bit, to see Mulder and Scully back again, and that never really happens until the revivals, and then there's an argument. It doesn't really happen in the same way there. But, so, you know, I loved this era where you had Spender and you had even Diana Fowley, and we'll talk about her in a bit, you know, and you had Krychek and you had the well-manicured man. And it's almost a shame that doesn't last, in a way.
But I think it's kind of, it's almost more valuable because it doesn't last. It feels, you know, like it feels very much like, again, not to drop the title too heavy, the end of an era. But it does, this wouldn't feel as momentous, or it wouldn't feel as big a deal as it is, even watching it in reruns. And even if you know, I'm not always sure I put my finger on exactly what it was with that huge cast and huge ensemble and finding space for everybody in the narrative. But I think that is a part of why it feels so big and so special. Like, if that era lasted longer, I think that you would lose some of that. And again, part of me, and this is probably something to talk about when we get to the 6th season, there is a sense of maybe kind of like going out on top, you know, kind of like going out at a point where this is the 11th most watched show on network television in the kind of season that it aired. You know, the 5th season, the most watched episode of The X-Files was Leonard Betts in the 4th season, but the most watched season overall with the highest average ratings was the 5th. This is kind of like peak X-Files. This is the X-Files at the top of its game. It's got a feature film coming out. It's got a single from Catatonia in the UK charts. Yeah. But it is a genuine bona fides cultural phenomenon. And it feels like, you know, I kind of like that period is contained. Because, I mean, you can argue And it's a conversation I suspect we'll be having over the 6th and 7th seasons. You could talk about like the end of an imperial age and the idea of the show, kind of the gradual decline of a show and kind of fading from relevance maybe, and kind of like whether the show itself declined or whether it simply kind of lost its grip on the zeitgeist, or whether it kind of just kind of lurched out of view, but kind of the slow withering away or changing or morphing of the X-Files that happens after this point. But I do like that, you mentioned that kind of huge cast, having all those people together makes this feel like an end. It feels like it has value because it's so short, that the show doesn't extend it on and keep running it further and further and further past its sell-by date. I mean, I really like Krycek as a character, but I think that there are points at which there's not really that much more you can do with Krycek, and you probably need to send him out to pasture. And I think the show maybe pushes him a little bit further than that. I really like the cigarette-smoking man as a character. I think he's amazing. But I also think at times there are points at which it might have been good for the show to draw a line under the character and say, you're done. That, like, he's great, we love him, but, like, this is his story. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end.
It's telling, isn't it, that after this, they kind of have to sort of low-key, mysteriously reintroduce Krycek in SR819 to try and remind everyone who he is and how important he is. Not just have him come back, like, oh, it's Krycek again. They have to put him in a wig, and they have to spend an entire episode. And everything, and then they have to spend an entire episode until you get to the end and you go, oh, it's Krycek. Wait, what? Okay, it's
also Senator Raymond J. Barry as well. Like, I kind of love that. Like, the return of like Senator Barry is almost as important as like Krycek.
As Krycek. And then later on that you only get, after One Son, you only get the smoking man crop up really of any kind of substance before Requiem, before his first death, quote unquote. Primarily in Amor Fati, and then for maybe one kind of scene in Closure, and then NME. So it's much more sparsed out, whereas in previous seasons he'd have cropped up maybe half a dozen times, and he'd be in the background somewhere, or there'd be, so it does sort of thin out over that time. And it does feel, especially with Krycek, it feels like they don't really know what to do with him till season 8, and then he has some sort of function in a way. But it's all, after this point, or certainly after the point of the Tunguska sort of Russia stuff, they don't really know what to do with Krycek, and he's sort of hanging on a bit, even though it's always fun to see him. So there's, it is interesting how they deal with all these characters. Anyway, at FBI headquarters, we see Skinner. He's having a little bit of he's checking out Mulder's work.
Enjoy this set. It's not going to be there very long.
Yeah, and nice few camera shots of some of the old cases like Dwayne Barry, and little reminders of the glory cases, and Skinner's asking Mulder, which is a bizarre question almost to ask, what are your plans? What are your plans for the future? And Mulder's like, this really, more of this that I've been doing.
When your boss comes down to your office and like is standing there looking reflective, turns to you and asks, "So, what do you want to do in the future?" Like, that's never a good sign. No. Yeah, it's like kind of like the follow up question is, you ever want to like break, want to like see the world, take some time off, maybe like start a second career, something like that. That's where that conversation's going, Mulder.
But bless him, Mulder's more like, I'm not going anywhere, am I? Like, this is the X-Files. This is my office. So, same as ever. And Skinner's like, because he knows full well what's coming down the pipe. That's the good thing. I like that in this episode, because yes, he's not obviously a bad guy, but there's always that little thing with Skinner that he knows a little bit more than they do, and he's got one ear or one foot in that camp, even though he's not a bad guy and he wants to help them. He does know more than they do at times. So he's heard that this chess game, this plan, this all plotted out sort of, plan to close down the X-Files and remove Mulder, is there. And there's a melancholy, I think, about this conversation from Skinner's point of view.
Skinner's basically dad. And I mean, even if Skinner doesn't literally know what's coming, Skinner, I think, is a mature adult who knows that, like, Camelot cannot last forever, that the golden age must come to an end. And whether kind of literally or just metaphorically, having a sense of that kind of coming. And again, like, this is something about the end. I don't know, maybe this is the time to kind of talk about it. the plot of the end makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, right? And again, like, X-Files plots making no sense is not a big deal, not a problem. I think as long as you have like a clear thematic underpinning, and as long as you know what you're about in capital letters, you're generally fine. But right, so couple of questions about like the basic plot structure of the end, right? First thing is Gibson prays, right? Gibson prays, who is a kid who can read minds. Right? Now, he has been reading minds forever. In fact, he actually talks about how horrible it is that he's been reading minds forever, right? Except apparently, the first person that he's ever told that he can read minds isn't his parents, but Mulder. And, like, literally all Mulder has to do to get that out of him is ask, hey, so can you read minds?
Can you read minds?
And Gibson's like, yeah, pretty much. Like, that's literally all it takes to get it out of the kid. It, like,
yeah.
Which is amazing given, like, they're, and again, this is probably a bit of a side tangent, but given how Gibson is consistently characterized as a little sociopath, like, very much, like, Gibson is very much kind of like Professor X kind of level creepy, where, like, the opening sequence where he murders his chess opponent.
I which is like that. Yeah, he blatantly does, doesn't he? He knows that the guy's going to die. He's like, yeah, okay.
Perfectly fine with it. Like, he could just call an usher over.
Yeah.
There's a Mountie right there. There's, like, literally, like, when the scene happens, a Mountie rushes over. All Gibson has to do is just pass a little note, or maybe just, like, run away from his chair into a dressing room. But no, he's like, I'm going to kill this dude. And then later on, where he has the conversation with Mulder and with Foley and with Scully, and he's like, you know, one of them is thinking about you, but I'm not going to tell you which one, because I totally get off on this power, which is, like, really creepy. But, like, okay, so ignoring, like, the plot contrivance of Gibson prays, who has apparently never told anybody about his psychic abilities, but also never shuts up about them. You have sort of like the weird situation with like is this a plot to shut down the X-Files, which you kind of alluded to there. And you have like Mulder suggests that towards the end of the episode with kind of Scully, where he's like, oh, it was a trap, it was all. And again, I think Zach Hanlon at the AV Club has described like being incredibly wary whenever like a story introduces a chess metaphor, because it's like, you know, I love The Seventh Seal. I think The Seventh Seal is a great movie, but a chess metaphor is hard to pull off without seeming a little bit pretentious. And you get these wonderful lines later on with the cigarette smoking man where he delivers, hold on, I've got the line here. You just take their pieces one by one until the board is clear. And it's like, yes, that's a chess metaphor, but you could also be talking about checkers. And like, you kind of long for like the, you know, sort of like the Bill and Ted moment where they just say Connect Four, where Gibson prays is just really good at Connect Four. The chess stuff feels like it's like chess is what smart people play. Therefore, the characters who are engaged in games back and forth in this episode are being very smart. They're moving in like 4 dimensions at the same time. Their minds are kind of racing in ways that you can't even fathom. And this kind of gets at kind of my big kind of issue with the episode, is that like it makes a big deal of all this stuff. And we talked about how it is very much a blockbuster. It's very much structured as a blockbuster. Everything in this episode feels momentous, with a capital momentous. But the problem is that like a lot of the internal logic doesn't make sense. So think about, if this was a plot to shut down the X-Files, it seems kind of strange that they only bring the cigarette smoking man into play after the assassin has been captured, right? Which suggests that like they don't have a way of getting the assassin executed without bringing the cigarette smoking man in. There's also the question of the assassin getting captured in the first place. Was that planned from the outset? Because, like, even if he had killed Gibson Praise, one imagines that he would want to get out of there without being captured, but somehow he manages to get captured and he's willing to spill the beans and everything like that. He's murdered, so you can guess he's not in on this conspiracy, which seems rather strange. Because it's like, hey, so my extraction. Want to talk about my extraction? That'd be grand. No, but seriously, when I kill the kid, how am I getting out of it? It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. But, like, even things like, say, the cigarette smoking man, where the cigarette smoking man is brought in, and there's, like, this conversation where they're under the underpass, and the well-manicured man is, like, you know, very clearly repulsed by what's going on, and the elders are like, look, we brought you back because you're the only person who knows how to deal with this, which implies that, like, a lot of the stuff that's happening isn't planned out, it's more improvisational, which creates all sorts of other problems in terms of internal logic. But, I mean, even things like all the cigarette smoking man does is bribe a guard to shoot the assassin in the face in prison. It's like, it's not a chess move. Like, that's not a chess move.
Is this almost kind of on point though for him, because he's classically kind of a syndicate conspirator who is blagging his way through all of this.
Absolutely. This is very much like the actual plotting mechanics of the episode are very much fitting with like kind of the Anasazi trilogy, which has this wonderful subtext that the people who are running the world have no idea what they're doing and we're all screwed anyway because they're so massively incompetent. The problem with the end is that like they're like weird improvisational chess game, which is like Gibson watches The Simpsons. And whenever I watch this episode and I think of the chess metaphor, I think of that sequence in The Simpsons where Mr. Burns hires an assassin to kill Abraham Simpson. And the assassin explains that there is one more way to kill a man, but it's as intricate and precise as a well-played game of chess. And then runs into the retirement home with a machine gun. That kind of feels a little bit like how the cigarette-smoking man's operating here. But the problem is that, like, in the Anasazi trilogy, it very clearly gets away from him. In fact, it's magical how it gets away from him. It's fantastic. It's one of the best things about the trilogy is the way in which the cigarette-smoking man is so far out of his depth and so unable to keep control of the chaos that's happening around him. And he's just as much a pawn or just as subject to these forces as Mulder and Scully. And that's what makes those 3 episodes brilliant. My problem with the end is, despite the fact that this ensuing chaos is happening around the cigarette-smoking man, and he's clearly so far out of his depth that his grand strategy, which apparently the entire syndicate never came up with the idea, why don't we just shoot the assassin in the face? And maybe burn the X-Files office down when we're done with it. I kind of love the idea of there being like so maybe we could write angry letters. It's like, no, we need the cigarette-smoking man. He always knows exactly how to deal with these problems. But again, like, the problem with the episode for me is that all of this works. Like, that's the problem. Is that, like, this absolutely insane, incredibly stupid conspiracy actually works pretty much perfectly to clockwork precision. And again, like, maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but it feels like I'm getting all of this out of my system, so let's just go with it anyway. But things like, you know, Gibson praise being the key to everything in the X-Files. And Mulder, like, again, not to stress the chess metaphor too much, but like going all in on the poker metaphor of the Gibson praise, where he's like, let's just like flag this to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General, who has like, apparently, you know, the X-Files have never managed to attract the attention of the Attorney General before, despite, you know, I don't know, stuff like, say, planes falling out of the sky in Tempest, Fugit and Max, to pick an example, or Mulder causing various diplomatic incidents overseas, you know, various other incidents like that. Car bombs blowing up, the attempted assassination of an assistant director of the FBI, but no, the psychic kid is what's finally a bit too much for the, like, you know, for the Attorney General of the United States. That's what finally gets the X-Files shut down. And there's a real sense of, and again, I don't want to be too harsh on the episode, because I understand that, like, a lot of this is dictated by, like, forces outside the narrative. And Carter is very clearly moving pieces around a chessboard, if you will, in order to kind of line up what he needs to happen for, you know, the 6th season and for Fight the Future to happen. And understand that, like, being in that situation, you're not always capable of being as elegant as you'd want to be. And again, you think of things like, say, for example, Game of Thrones with the 8th season, where you have, like, a destination you need to reach, but you have a very, like, finite amount of time in which to reach it. You have certain logistics in terms of actors, mechanics, and budget that you have to do in order to realize that destination. And you have, like, the confines of network television, where you have to film an episode. You don't get to delay it until you figure out how the story works. Like, again, George R.R. Martin with the, like, Game of Thrones, he has taken decades to figure out how to make that story end properly. And whatever problems the 8th season has, and I'm not going to pretend the 8th season doesn't have problems, like, a lot of those problems are forgiven by the fact that those writers were solving in the space of 2 years problems that Martin couldn't resolve in 2 decades. And again, like, you look, I'm with the end part, a lot of me forgives all that stuff that I just talked about, all that like laboured chess metaphors, all that really awkward, like how perfect is the cigarette smoking man's conspiracy planning? Because I understand that like it is more about reaching the destination, is, as you described it, a means to an end earlier on. But sorry, I just feel like I had to kind of get all that out there. I apologise to listeners for that therapy session. I would, now that it's out there, I feel like I like the end a great deal. I really appreciate what it does. You
turned around on it. No, you know what? I think what you've articulated there is spot on, and I think there are, and that's the thing. It's all said with a lot of love because there is a lot to really enjoy. Yeah, and we've always been like that on this podcast. It's picking out the flaws while also just lapping up a lot of the stuff in there. And I mean, the ending itself is problematic for quite a lot of fans because of one character in particular, I think, in that Diana Foley is introduced in this episode, played by Mimi Rogers. And she comes in, doesn't she, at the beginning when Spender is taking over the case about Klebenau's assassination, and he can't see, obviously, what Mulder can, because, who can.
And what a wonderful jackass Mulder is in that sequence. It's one of my great Mulder as a jackass sequences. It's the, if you have any questions, we'll wait to the end. I don't have any questions. I just think you're wrong.
Yeah.
Which is one of the great Mulder lines.
He's a bit like that all through this episode, actually. In quite a few scenes, particularly when he's with Spender, he's really going out of his way to kind of point out that Spender is an idiot and he doesn't know what he's talking about.
First I thought you were incompetent. Then I thought you were arrogant. Now I think you're dangerous. It's like, wait, somebody needs to get Mulder a copy of How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Well, this is it. And in a way, I feel for Spender because we've obviously seen him introduced, and we will talk about Fowler in a minute, but let's just talk about Spender while we're here. Because we have seen Spender introduced in Patient X and Red and the Black, and he was a bit officious and he was sort of in the way, but he was also humanised in the fact he had this relationship with Cassandra and that he was looking for his mother and all that. And that Cassandra's not mentioned in this episode, even though she's still missing, and that will come back obviously in Two Fathers and everything. But I felt for him a little bit here because I suppose with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that Spender is actually a good guy and he just ends up getting caught in all these forces that he doesn't really understand and he's out of his depth. And he's sort of courted throughout this episode by the smoking man. We know that he's his son, but Spender doesn't until the end. But I feel sorry for him because the whole episode he's Mulder basically trying to make him look like an idiot. And the episode having to reinforce Mulder being right. So, when he's talking about alien astronauts and Spender's going, "Oh, have a word, Mulder." We know Mulder's right. We know that Gibson is what he seems to be. He is the missing link. He is, and it's just a bit of a shame for poor Spender throughout the episode.
If Spender had turned up on Profiler as an FBI agent, he'd be fine.
Yeah,
or operated in the real world. He just happens to have the misfortune of having shown up on Mulder's TV show, where Mulder's it's gonna call it a day. It's invisible cow goat suckers, and Spender's like, that's ridiculous. 40 minutes later, it's like, well, shows you, Spender.
Exactly, and then I suppose in the middle of that, you have Diana Foley, don't you? Because she's classically brought. She's one of those characters that she's almost like the epitome of what they tried to do with Phoebe Green in Fire. At the very beginning of the and then they flirt with in characters like Bambi and War of the Coprophages in having a frisson with Mulder. But she is sort of that ultimate version of the mysterious woman from Mulder's past. And I kind of feel like, if anything, I think one of the things that I think is one of the weaker aspects of the end, and again, it's the curse of the season finale for poor Scully, because Scully spends most of this episode just being fecked off that Mulder is talking to another woman. She doesn't do a fat lot else, does she, really? She has a little chat with Gibson, which again is all about the fact that she's, she might be jealous of Diana. And it's, again, one of those episodes that Scully doesn't really do a lot, and she just moons after him a little bit. And I when I look back, and it's going to make everyone hate Diana Foley more than they will anyway, because she's come out of nowhere to claim this, potentially romantic past with Mulder, certainly being this...
His chickadee.
His chickadee, right, as Froki says. And also somebody who... And again, this is where you have to have a suspension of belief, because she would have come up before. She was there when he created the X-Files. He was possibly married to her as the wedding ring on his finger in Travellers. Somebody would have met, surely, Byers or Langley or whoever would have gone.
Byers, who's like, I always wondered why they split up, but I never asked anybody about it.
I never asked anybody. Well, and surely at some point, one of them would have gone, hey, Mulder, this is a bit like when, you and Diana investigated that thing with the cave and Scully got, who?
I kind of love the idea. I kind of love the idea
that not happened in 5 years.
I kind of love the idea that maybe it was such a bad breakup that everybody around Mulder's like, no, you don't mention Diana. Just do a little kind of like a little whenever the name comes up, that little sort of cutthroat gesture. Just going to cut it off. No.
Don't say anything. Yeah.
No, when you did that by yourself, when you discovered the X-Files by yourself, Mulder. And again, this is one of the things. And again, this is the show being deliberately and consciously trollish. And again, we kind of mentioned the show having this wonderful relationship with fans, where it did this thing for them in Vancouver, which is kind of huge spectacle, kind of real, we appreciate you, all the support you've shown us and all the love you've given us. And again, when I say being trollish, it is kind of a little bit cheeky and tongue-in-cheek, because obviously all the writers, including, say, Carter and including Spotnitz, have both been candid about the role of Foley is to act as a spoiler, is to rile up the fans. And oh boy, did they succeed at that. And again, there's something kind of cheeky about making her a woman from Mulder's past, despite the fact that this, as you pointed out, has not worked at all, consistently at any point in the show's history. VB Green was one of the most spectacular misfires in a season that is populated by spectacular misfires. The point of a first season is to work out things that don't work. And one of the things that you figured out didn't work in the first season was Mulder has an ex-girlfriend and Scully is jealous. But for some reason you're kind of circling back around 100 episodes later and go, no. What if we cast an actor who has worked with Duchovny before, so it has a little bit of layer of kind of metatextual stuff going on there. Maybe add a little psychic kid in there to maybe add a little bit of soap opera dynamics, kind of. Maybe have the lone gunman in their PJs, which are adorable, might I add, but kind of show up and add a little bit of tension there. And then again, this thing where Scully is reduced, as you pointed out, to pining. Her big scene with Gibson, which is this is the kid on which Mulder has bet the entire future of the X-Files division. And Scully is kind of just sitting down talking with him about Diana. That's her big concern at that moment in time with everything that's up in the air. Scully is worried about Diana. And again, these sequences you have where she walks up and down the halls or she sees Mulder with Diana. It's like an ex-girlfriend thing. And again, a part of me thinks, shouldn't be too harsh on this. It's hard to kind of overstate the degree to which the popularity of the X-Files, particularly as a mainstream hit, was rooted in that will they, won't they, Mulder-Scully dynamic, Again, the unsung sexual tension, which is, or unresolved sexual tension, the UST, which originated in X-Files fandom, shipping, which originated in X-Files fandom, but even, not even just among X-Files fandom, the Catatonia single that I mentioned earlier, Mulder and Scully, uses Mulder and Scully's relationship as a metaphor for, modern love, as love in the 90s, is paranoid, to quote Blur. But this idea of a relationship that isn't conventional and kind of isn't defined by boundaries in the way that we expect relationships to be. So I completely understand why the show leans into the soap opera dynamics of, we're doing a love triangle, except somehow there's a creepy sociopathic psychic kid involved. I think that, to be fair to the show, at its peak, it was very good at balancing all those plays. I think episodes like Detour do that balancing act remarkably well. I don't think The End does, but I can see why it's trying, and I can see why it's doing what it's doing. I don't think Foley works over the entirety of her time with the show, but I also understand why the show thought that it was something that it could try. And if we're being entirely honest, it only really tries for about half a season. She does again pop up at the the bridging story between the 6th and 7th seasons, but generally speaking, she's only an ongoing concern for about half a season. At which point they figure out it's not working at all. There's no way to actually make this work in the way that we want it to. So I don't begrudge them for trying. I don't begrudge them for it failing, and I kind of admire how much they go for it, how much they commit to it. But you're entirely right that it does Gillian Anderson wrong. It squanders Anderson's talents, and in the context of season finales, where they're always a mixed bag for Scully. There's always a question of, like, what does Scully do in next Files season finale? Does it end up with episodes like Talitha Kumi, where she basically does background work while Mulder gets to do all the exciting stuff and Scully becomes like an exposition vehicle? Is it here where she serves as like an emotional leverage in like Mulder's love triangle? It's interesting that, Mulder doesn't have to worry about somebody coming and seducing Scully away from him. It's always, Mulder is the object of affection or the object of fascination. And even in this episode, you have that shot of Mulder crying on his couch while Scully answers his phone for him, which again, I get that like a large part of the Mulder and Scully dynamic is the idea that Scully is cognizant and mature and responsible in a way that Mulder simply isn't. But there are points where the show, I think, pushes that a little bit too far, and the relationship starts to feel uncomfortably like something from, a 90s indie movie about a slacker who just won't grow up and the woman who has to make him.
Yeah.
There are moments in this episode where it feels a lot like this, where Mulder's like, I'm going to have a meaningful heart-to-heart with my ex-girlfriend and completely not talk about it with my current partner who is, but also the script is going to be written so that my ex-partner is jealous and possessive and completely unprofessional at the same time. So I don't seem like I'm being a jackass in this situation. Yeah, it doesn't really work, I think.
Well, it's also that I think, and obviously the movie famously has the kiss that never happens, but...
That cock-blocking bee.
Yeah, damn bee. But, from this point onwards... you really are building to the point that they are going to be together. There is a lot more in season 6 and season 7. There is so much more of the tactile stuff. There's things like, Triangle where they kiss, and just so many instances throughout those, the whole Arcadia thing of them, pretending they're married together, and all this kind of thing and living. Yeah. So there are so many points where you feel that they are edging further towards, and then the whole stuff at the end of Amor Fati where, you're my constant and all that kind of thing. It's all very, it's almost romance. And that's the thing. It's almost like Diana Foley is so obviously not going to be that person for Mulder that it almost feels cheap that we have to go through this entire storyline, that Scully has to feel this way when it just isn't, it isn't going to be, she's there for a function that, in some ways, it's good in a sense that she turns out to be in league with the Smoking Man. Because if she wasn't, then literally her only point would have been to sow some sort of, dodgy soap opera sort of discord.
Theatrical thing,
it is good in a way that she ends up being the Smoking Man's confidant, and that adds that extra layer to her. Because, heaven forbid that she's only there for that other reason. And obviously, the fact that she's shot at the end of this, it makes you wonder whether, at the time, Chris Carter didn't know whether he was going to bring her back. And then he might... it's hard to say, because it sort of... it could have potentially leave the door open for just kill her off or forget about her, because Scully says at the end that she's barely maintaining her pressure. The suggestion at the end of this is that Fowley might not make it, and she might have just turned up for one episode and got shot. So there was a window in that they could have just got rid of her,
And part of me wonders, though, if you had just gotten rid of her, would it retroactively make this seem even more of a kind of a cul-de-sac? Because you'd be like, well, at least this plot is setting up a further plot down the road that turns out to be a dead end, as opposed to being a dead end of itself. Like, it would be more efficient, but, like, watching it, you'd be like, in that alternate universe where Fowley dies, we'd be like, so, Diana Fowley, what was the deal with that? What did they even think they were going to do with her as a character? And again, it feels like a huge shame because, I think Mimi Rogers is a good actress and stuff that I've seen her in.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's an interesting dynamic there. I do think that, you're entirely right. It's very much serving to keep the Mulder and Scully dynamic kind of like to maintain the tension while also maintaining the kind of chaste quality to it. Because again, I think we talked on this podcast before about Carter's fascination with chaste romances, where he seems more comfortable writing a romance. And again, like the entire show of Harsh Realm, to pick an example. But I think that Emily Vanderwerf has written on like the AV Club about how impossible it is to imagine Frank Black and Catherine Black having sex. Even though Jordan exists. Despite the fact they're married, they still feel like they're in a chaste Carter romance. And it really feels like watching the end, that Foley exists as a way to extend that. And again, I say that as somebody who really likes the kind of X-Files like romantic comedy aspect of it. Like, I like the bit in the 6th season where the show becomes like the strangest, greatest paranoia, sort of like the greatest paranormal mystery of our time is going to be figuring out what like love is like for 20-somethings in this upside down, topsy-turvy modern world where cows falling out of the sky are somewhat less important than figuring out how to ask out a woman that you like. I kind of like that aspect of the 6th season where it takes a turn into kind of the surreal romantic comedy kind of universe. But I do think that, Foley is transparently... Again, it's that chess metaphor which becomes kind of this weight around the episode's neck where it's like, I can see the pieces being maneuvered in the way that they need to go in order to prolong the game that Carter has found himself having to play.
I can understand that, but it's also why you could never imagine a scenario, I think, where Foley, or even Spender in a way, could appear in Fight the Future and it makes sense. Like they feel like they're from an entirely different kind of world. When you watch Fight the Future, you can understand the smoking man, you can understand the well-manicured man and the elders and things like that. And I suppose you could have understood Krycek being in there in some fashion. But it does feel like they are like so far away from that, which is literally in between those, their key episodes for those two, that it's very strange. It's very unusual, really, in that she sort of plays that, particularly Foley, plays that function of being in these sort of crossing these two eras of the show and then just operating on the... She's a strange character, and she's also a character, I think, who is very much, in terms of, continuity and in terms of canon and in terms of... I suppose in one sense, I like the ambiguity of, was she married to... Were they actually married? Were they that together? What is this whole missing chapter of them investigating the X-Files together or finding the X-Files together? It's quite interesting, and it's interesting that I quite like the fact we probably never know that, and it's a chapter that's always very ambiguous. But on the other hand, it feels so much of one of those ideas that is crowbarred in and clearly was never part of any plan. And I know there was never any concrete plan with the X-Files. I get that. It wasn't that kind of show. But at the same time, she feels so jarringly sort of wedged in to create something, in terms of Mulder and Scully, that I never really bought the character. I've never been one of those people that hates her, because I don't feel that way in terms of the characters and the way I approach the show. It's not like that. And Mimi, like you said, Mimi Rogers is a good actor, and I think she serves an interesting function in the plot, but I don't feel like you needed her in a way. I think you could have absolutely done this story without that, and whether it would have been better, I don't know. But really, when you look at it and you think about the plot of the end, there's not a lot that happens. Like you've explained, there's a few conversations, there's a shooting, a couple of shootings, and that's it, really. And the whole centre of it is built around this idea of Mulder's final revelation of the truth in terms of Gibson praise. But it's odd. I think that is odd, because it's not very tangible. It's like in previous seasons there's been something that tangibly, like the end of Gethsemane, there's tangibly an EBE that he could potentially find. At the end of Talitha Kumi, there is tangibly Jeremiah Smith, a shapeshifter.
Also Shit Excalibur.
Yeah, Shit Excalibur. At the end of Anasazi, there is tangibly the boxcar full of aliens and the revelation of, oh my God, what have they done? At the end of the Erlenmeyer flask, there is tangibly the Erlenmeyer flask with the little alien embryo. What is there tangibly at the end of the end? An idea.
It feels very much like it's kind of a placeholder. Like, there's a lot of this episode feels like it was kind of mapped out, and there's like ideas and there's like little index cards on a board, and a sense of we'll come back and we'll fill that in later, except we ran out of time, so just run with first idea, best idea. And a lot of things that you're right, where the things work as concepts rather than as characters, where Foley works as a concept rather than a character, where you can tell that they needed something to serve as, inverted commas, the key to the X-Files, but they couldn't figure out what it was, so just make it a psychic kid, which is, rather abstract kind of way of approaching it. What I do think, actually, just to go back very briefly to what you're talking about Foley and the show's mythology and stuff like that, and the way in which she fits with the show's mythology, one of the things that's interesting about the 5th season as a whole is that, like, the 4th season of The X-Files was very much focused on going back to the show's, like, original kind of starting point. So things like bringing back the character of Max Fennig, for example, and things like that, and kind of bringing back the character of Blevins and kind of, like, closing, or Blevo, as we call him, bringing back the, Blevo, or bringing back kind of, like, the Scully's function at the end of the season where she comes back and she completes the journey that she started at the start of the 1st season as well, and kind of offering a bit of closure around that as well. One of the things that's interesting about the 5th season that I really like about it and find kind of interesting is that, like, it is a lot more ambiguous. And there's a sense of, like, part of this being down to the show, I suspect, realizing that it was not going to end after 5 seasons. And I think Carter's talked about, like, Redux as the point at which he figured out the show could just keep writing itself going forward. And what you see is the show not only just writing itself going forward, inventing all these new characters and loose ends and tangents that's going to follow, like, past Fight the Future into the 6th season, but also going back and, like, creating and exploring lacunas in the show's own past and history, where the 4th season was about the 1st season as it actually existed. Think of things like, say, the cigarette smoking man listening to recordings from the pilot in Musings of the Cigarette Smoking Man, a very tangible physical object. And again, that physicality that you mentioned, the sense of the past being something you can physically hold that actually exists. In the 5th season, you have something that's very much the opposite, where the past is this big nebulous thing that exists, like, as an abstract concept. And you have, like, it's notable that during the 5th season, you have no fewer than 3 competing theories about how the X-Files came to be. 3 different origin stories, which are hard to reconcile with one another in terms of explaining how Mulder came to work on the X-Files. You have Unusual Suspects, which basically postulates in that wonderful Vince Gilligan manner, maybe Mulder got gassed out of his mind and basically latched onto the X-Files. Had a paranoid breakdown, imagined his sister had been abducted, and built an entire mythology around that. On the second hand, you have the episode kind of Travelers, which is, well, what if Mulder actually met the person who had previously worked on the X-Files and was kind of drawn into them that way? And here as well, then you have the version of Foley, which is like, what if he and Foley found it together? Now, obviously, you can, if you're interested in kind of canon continuity, find a way to weave those 3 elements together so they connect. Like, they're not mutually exclusive, but they do feel like they're different. They all feel like different origin stories. And one of the things that I like about it, and I think you're right when you say that you like the idea that, you know, you're never going to go back and we're never going to get that Foley and Mulder origin story. I like that as well because it makes the opening of the X-Files kind of very open-ended. It opens it up to possibilities and kind of like permutations. There are any number of ways the X-Files could have started, or Mulder could have come to work on the X-Files. And I like the 5th season. It's like, yeah, sure, there are 3 different possibilities in this season as a whole, and we're not going to tell you which one of them's real. And I really like that aspect of it, because it makes the show's past as kind of open and nebulous as its future, and as uncertain, and I really like that aspect of it, even if I agree with you entirely that things like Gibson Praise and things like Diana Foley feel more like kind of index cards with Mulder's ex-girlfriend, ! And the key to the X-Files, ! Written on a board, without any real thought about like what they actually mean, what they actually do, and what their actual function is in the plot.
I really do think if they ever rebooted the X-Files, you would absolutely have, like, if not the beginning of the show be how does Mulder find the X-Files, it would be flashbacks. It would be an episode that you would absolutely see how he finds this, either with Scully or before Scully or whatever. It would remove any of the ambiguity.
Like episode 11, I think, of like 13 would be where it would hit. It would be kind of like, and you'd have this retroactive revelation where it would turn out the cigarette smoking man was secretly like the first X-Files thing, and then that would lead into the cliffhanger, the 2-part season finale or something, you know? Yeah,
definitely. And I think you're absolutely right about the ultimate revelation. I've never really truly understood, and maybe I've always been missing something, but I've never really truly understood how Gibson's ability can unlock the entire paranormal, supernatural spectrum. You know, and even Foley turns around and says, "How can you quantify the spiritual?" You know, she throws some cold water on this assertion, and I really do think that. I mean, I don't understand how you get there from that, really. And I know that they're
I'm on Team
these...
Spender, #Team Spender.
Yeah.
Team Big Spender is where I'm on right now.
Big Spender. Right,
when he's in the meeting, when he's in the meeting and he's like, "What the hell are you talking about?"
What?
And the show kind of assumes because Mulder's the protagonist, the audience is going to go, "Shut the hell up, Spender." And I'm saying, no, listen to the man.
I'm actually a little bit like, hang on, alien astronauts, yeah, okay, if you've read Chariot of the Gods and all that kind of stuff, fine, okay? If you watch Ancient Aliens on TV, fine, okay? We all know the story of all that. The aliens built the pyramids, etc. And Spender even jokes about that, doesn't he? He says, "You want to give up this for the secrets to the pyramids?" And I'm a bit like, well, that's exactly what it is. And I don't understand how Mulder for 1 minute thinks that this can get him this, validation for everything that he talked about that he wants to still be doing when Skinner's asking him about what are your plans. How is this it? I don't understand, and I've never really understood that. And I feel like it's asking you to take a leap into something that I don't think the show would ever have known how to really actualise and explain. How to make a psychic little sociopath, as you've said, into a tangible, aliens are real, we're all aliens, thing, which obviously they then play with, don't they, over the next season and a half or whatever. But I don't feel like it has anything there.
Scully has had a long journey to this point in the show. She's become more open-minded. She's opened herself up to the possibilities. If you want to be grim and cynical, you could argue she's been beaten down by the fact Mulder's been right 117 times up until this point. But no, more seriously though, even allowing for that, there are points at which you're like, Scully should probably be doing something or saying something or telling Mulder to stop talking, where he's doing things like that cliche of, well, what if Einstein and Isaac Newton were more human than human? Do you know that most of us have genes that we don't use? And it's like you're waiting for Robert De Niro and Bradley Cooper to show up from Limitless and go, "Hey, Mulder, have we got the drug we want you to try?" And the episode goes all in, and it doesn't even pause. It doesn't normally in the show there'll be this kind of hand-holding phase where Mulder will be like, actually, if you look at the data and statistically speaking, and there's lots of surveys that have been discredited, here you get, there is a little bit of that exposition, but it's crammed into a single tiny scene.
Yeah.
And it's just well, I'm glad we resolved that. Let's carry on. And the episode never even kind of blinks.
Yeah, you're a little okay. So we're going with it, aren't we? Yeah.
I'm glad we had this chat. You pretty much expect Mulder to pat Spender on the shoulder and say, "I'm glad we had this talk," and just never mention it again.
But this is why I really like the Biogenesis trilogy, because it builds on some of these ideas and it sort of takes them to the next level. But it spends I know they're three sort of different kind of episodes, but it takes its time. That trilogy takes its time to get you to a point it wants to get you to, and I really appreciate that for having the space to do it. The end probably should have been a two-parter, really, and they should have found ways to expand some of the aspects of this. It's a bit much thrown at you to swallow, and hence why it just ends in a big burning inferno just to make the point of, "Whoa, he's going to blow it all up." Some of that.
Yeah. Well, I guess, Mulder, you're not meeting the Attorney General after all.
That should have been the final line. It should have been while Scully's holding him, with a little bit of a Curb Your Enthusiasm theme playing over the fire. Well, I guess you're not meeting the Attorney General after all. Bum, bum. That would have been great.
It's a great image, though. The fire seems a bit much, but it's a fantastic, striking image, and it does grab your attention and it holds your attention. And again, it's that aspect of, you pointed out, this episode doesn't really have anything real or tangible to grab onto, but the burning of the X-Files office is it feels like it's momentous enough almost to retroactively justify all the abstract stuff that we've had leading up to it, to be fair. And again, it's wonderfully shot by R.W. Goodwin. That shot of the lights coming in through the window, the red and the blue kind of siren lights as Mulder's kind of staring over the destruction, is very, very effective and very, very emotive. And it kind of, like, this is why it gets a 6 out of 10, which is an above average score, statistically speaking, is because it does manage to leverage that for me. It does, like, that final image is striking. It's one of the images I think about when I think about the show, even if, like, intellectually I know, well, like, this is just, again, the first season finale being replayed. They've already shut down the X-Files. And, like, yes, shutting down the X-Files is historically a better idea than Scully's jealous of Mulder's ex-girlfriend. So, you know, if you are going to bring back a first season idea, this is a pretty workable one as they go, but it still feels a little, like, intellectually I know I've seen this before. But that image is so strong that it's like, I'm happy to watch it again. Yeah, and they play that final moment with an appropriate level of gravitas and scope and scale, you know, and emotion. I think for it to be sold, you know, it almost is slightly overwrought with the music and everything like that. And the final shot of the dun 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 as it ends, you know, that kind of really sort of hammering home, you know, the thematic idea, and you know that we're almost an audience removed from what we're watching in a way. There's a meta aspect to this whole episode, as you've said, and it's good. It's an interesting final image to a very packed, very incidental, sometimes exciting, often fun, often baffling hour of television that's only the X-Files could do, I think, you know. And that, listeners, was the story of how the FBI decided that they would digitize all records going forward. Right, well, let's get into some feedback then from the listeners. I thought let's try and do this actually as a mix of things, because I've asked people to give their top 3 and bottom 3 as well as tell us about the end. So why don't we sort of interweave this with our own top 3 and bottom 3 as well, to do it that way. So if we go from our third worst and our third best and work our way up as we talk with other people's. So let's start off with a top one then. So what would you say your third best episode of season 5 is, Darren? Again, this is a phenomenal season. There are, and again, looking at it now when I was formulating my list, there are no top episodes. There's no real average episodes. There are episodes that I really like and a handful of episodes that I really dislike. So like whittling it down to 3 ones that I really like is quite tough, and a lot of competition for that kind of slot. So I think that with the third one, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky. I'm probably going to be a little bit unconventional. I suspect I'm the only person for whom this episode is going to make that list, but I'm going to go with Kill Switch, the William Gibson episode. Yes, well, I did threaten to do it earlier on, but it's fairly high up. I love Kill Switch. I think it's a great episode. It is, and it's so unusual for the show. It's so experimental for the show. It looks absolutely fantastic. And yet, despite the fact that it is unusual for the show, it taps into so many of the core themes of the series as well. This kind of paranoia, this idea of reality breaking down, this sense of experimentation, and this what is the nature of reality, plus kind of encapsulating that theme that runs through the 5th season as a whole, which is this idea of like children murdering parents, which is present even in like terrible episodes, like the one that we may be referencing shortly, Schizogyny, for example, which are kind of like, but like the season has this wonderful consistent theme of like children murdering parents, and again, if you want to get Freudian, we can talk about like why that might be a season the theme you're seeing in this season, but it is kind of like even present in Kill Switch, which is one of the most unique, distinct episodes that the X-Files ever made. It is very clearly not like any other episode of the X-Files, but it is also simultaneously very much an X-Files episode, and managing to be both of those things while also being fantastically entertaining in its own right is just why I love it, and why I think it's underrated, and maybe why I kind of slotted it into the third slot, because I'm not entirely sure it is the third best, but it's my third favorite comfortably. Yeah,
I've gone for similar, actually, in terms of maybe choosing favourites to some extent over maybe what are critically the best. So I get why Killswitch would be up there. I did the episode with Brooker talking about that, and there were, we did unpick flaws, and I think there were certain elements that work better than others. But it's such a pleasure. Like, whenever I watch the episode, I always enjoy it, and I think it's got so that I think it might have, if not the best teaser sequence, but one of the best teaser sequences the show ever did. Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. So, yeah, good choice. Really good choice. I would say for my third best episode of Season 5, I'm going for Travellers, which you mentioned before. Like you say, Killswitch is underrated, and I agree. I really think Travellers is underrated. I feel like it doesn't get a lot of love because A, it doesn't have Scully in it. B, it doesn't have Mulder in much of it. It's set entirely in the past. And I think for a lot of people, that sort of 50s McCarthy-era setting and the focus on an entirely different character in Arthur Dales puts people off. But I think, Travellers is the pilot for a show that in an ideal world, we would have got. A 50s
Well, Dark
era.
Skies, almost.
Yeah, dark, absolutely. Like Dark Skies. I mean, what I wouldn't give to see the Arthur Dales prequel series of the X-Files, set in that era. It's
Over
got
hills
so
and
mu-
dales.
Yeah. There you go, it writes itself. And I think, it's not altogether a massively compelling story with like the alien parasite thing coming out of people's mouths. And there are certain elements of it that maybe drag. But I love like things like the inclusion of Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover and all
Garrett
Garrett
Delahunda's in it as well, isn't he? As a guest star.
I think he's Edward Skur. He's like the bad guy.
He's the guy with the spider. Yeah,
with the parasite and the whole comparisons, of the potential alien threat lined up against communism, as it was viewed in the 50s. I love it. I think it's so rich, and it sort of fills. It sort of continues some of the themes that we saw in Critchgay talking about in Redux. As well. And it's sort of it's a really sort of interesting period of X-Files history that is sketched out. And I'd love people to go back and look at that in a slightly different way, because I think if you don't approach it from the traditional sense of an X-File, and maybe it's me, I've got a love of history, American history as well, political history. I think it's great. So that's my one. I don't expect that to make many top 3 lists, if I'm honest, Darren, but I thought I'll get it in there.
No, it's a good one. I have a soft spot for it as well. I really like the monster in it as well. And again, you can see that's kind of influence of Alien, the movie Alien, kind of cycling through as well. And again,
definitely.
That really, again, that theme of, again, almost sexual violence, where the creature kind of into the mouth, which is really unsettling and really disturbing in a way that some of the best X-Files stuff kind of truly is. I can see that very, very easily.
So let's get. So Michael Little is the first bit of feedback. He says the end. Talking about the end, he said the end is fine. I think it's a highly watchable, despite being a disappointing end to a fantastic season. While it works as a nice goodbye to the Vancouver era, there isn't really much story here. There are 2 scenes of true beauty. I love the chat between Mulder and Skinner about his long-term plans in the basement office. In addition, the cliffhanger with the burnt office is a striking image. Too bad Erlenmeyer Flass did the closing of the X-Files much better. Like I said, it's fine. Similar sentiments, I suppose. And his top 3 and bottom 3 are in order: Folie à Deux at number 1, Bad Blood at number 2, Christmas Carol at number 3, and his bottom 3 are number 1, Schizogyny. I feel like this might be a recurring thing. Number 2, Chinga, and number 3, controversial, I know, he says, Postmodern Prometheus. In the bottom 3 episodes. Now that's interesting, I think.
That isn't it. Well, again, Postmodern Prometheus is an episode I have a very interesting relationship with. I'm going to be very tentative because I suspect, based on past conversations, we may end up talking about this as our own list progress, possibly.
Ooh, well, why not? Let's strike while the iron is hot. What would you give your third bottom episode of the X-Files, Darren?
This is going to be controversial, and it's not going to be controversial for the reason that saying Postmodern Prometheus is. This is going to be controversial because people are going to ask, what the hell could rank lower than this? Schizogyny is my third least favourite episode of the season.
Interesting.
I know. There are apparently
curious.
2 worse episodes this season than Schizogyny. And again, Schizogyny is a mess of an episode. It's horribly paced. It doesn't really work. The guest cast, and again, I feel bad singling out like teenage actors, but the guest cast are terrible in it. And And it also doesn't really have a central kind of cohesive understanding of what it's doing or why it's doing it. It's just a mess of an episode of television. And yet, in spite of that, I have a bit of a soft spot for it, because even in this terrible episode of television, even in this episode that doesn't work at all, you still have that kind of thematic understanding of what the fifth season is about. So this idea of kind of like, again, the relationship between parents and children, and the idea that children eventually murder their parents, which runs through the entire season in interesting ways. And again, I like the image of the killer trees. I like the idea of the ground literally swallowing people up as a kind of a horror trope. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all.
Yeah, it's a big misfire. Whether it'll come up on my bottom three, we will see. But my number three, I'm going for my third bottom episode. I'm going for Emily, which is obviously part two of the Scully sort of centric mythology episode. I think I never really loved Christmas Carol when I was younger, but I feel like there's definitely more craft in Christmas Carol, and it has, some interesting things, and it's feels a bit more of a meaty episode. Emily is just bonkers. Yeah, not in a good way. Emily makes Terma look like Anasazi. It's that rubbish. Like, it just ties in all of the, more knotty, odder aspects of the black oil mythology, and the clones, and the children bred like in Memento Mori, and all these things, and it stews them up in this weird brew, which then links into Scully and her wanting a child and her ovaries and all this kind of thing. And you think it's the point when Mulder basically goes all Charles Bronson on the shapeshifter.
Yes, that's exactly it.
That you go, what is this? Like, and it just shows. I think it's got like about 4 or 5 writers, that one. And you think this is an epitome of when there are too many cooks spoiling the broth, I think, here.
This is one of the rare Gilligan mythology episodes. And I would argue, not to spoil what I'm going to be talking about later on, I would argue it's the worst script that Gilligan contributed to
Probably.
In the entire history of the show.
Yeah, could be.
I agree entirely with everything that you said, and I might be adding some hot sauce to it in a moment.
Well, we'll see when we get there. So, Dan Gia says about the end, I remember liking the episode, but felt the cliffhanger left a bit to be desired. That feeling went away quite fast when Fight the Future was released the next month. I realised the film was the true season payoff. And again, we've kind of said similar. And that triggers some nice little conversation in the basement group about that between a few different people. Andrew Levitt says, the end is a fantastic conclusion to the brilliant Season 5, as well as the show's initial years in Vancouver. It continues the familial issues introduced in Patient X and the Red and the Black, as well as the troubles within the Syndicate. It introduces Foley as a foil for Scully and a love interest for Mulder. And it introduces Gibson Praise as someone who can not only read minds, but also could potentially be the proof Mulder and Scully have been seeking for about the existence of alien-human hybrids. Mark Snow's score is as bombastic as the episode's content, and R.W. Goodwin's last directorial job for the series is dark, foreboding and emotional. Scully's jealousy of Foley is well played, and the destruction of the X-Files themselves is shocking. The only thing I dislike about the end is that it doesn't even attempt to tie into Fight the Future. Other than that, I know I enjoy this episode much more than most. And his top 3 are Kill Switch, Bad Blood at number 1, Bad Blood at number 2, and Folie à Deux at number 3. Folie à Deux is doing well so far. And his bottom 3 are Mind's Eye at number 1, Travellers at number 2. Sorry, Andrew, and Emily at number 3. So we share that one together. So yeah, why don't we go back to the top then? Why don't we say, what's your second best episode of season 5, Darren?
I'm absolutely going to cheat on this one. I'm going to say Patient X and the Red and the Black as a two-parter.
Fine. You can have it.
I did the two-parter with Kurt and talked about them. And again, I talked about one of the interesting things about them is that individually they're imperfect episodes, I think. In fact, they have very clear problems, each of them does. But when you take them both together and watch them as a kind of like a miniature feature film, I think they balance each other out almost perfectly. They're my second favourite mythology episode in the show. They do pretty much everything that I ask a mythology episode to do, in that they are exciting, they're thrilling, they've got wonderful characterization, they're propulsive, but they also have a fair amount of what, if you were being uncharitable, you would describe as pretentious navel-gazing nonsense, but what I would describe as rich thematic content. And I absolutely adore that aspect of it, how it manages to balance both of those things remarkably well. And again, you can hear me rave about those two episodes if you want to go back and listen to the episodes in question, but they are a delight.
Yeah, they are really good. I agree. I would say my second is, again, not necessarily... Well, actually, this probably would make the top 3 of a lot of people. My number 2 is Detour.
That's good.
Because I love that episode. I think it's got lots of heart to it. It's funny. The score is brilliant. It's one of Mark Snow's best scores. As I talked about, I had a great fun talking to Carl Sweeney and Sarah Blair about it. And that the whole subversion of the fact that when you get to the end, you feel like it might have another sting in the tail. It doesn't quite do it. You have the monster under the bed with the glowing red eyes. And it's just a lot of fun. It's just really well written, really well staged, and I think it's got a lot of really, really enjoyable X-Files elements to it. So that's one of my favourites. So yeah, that's my number 2.
An absolute joy. I really, really love Detour. And again, it's such a great episode. It's one that, like, you understand watching that, even if you are not a shipper, or like myself, shipping agnostic, you understand why that works so perfectly as part of the show. Why you would just happily spend 45 minutes with Mulder and Scully just hanging out together every week, even if, the monster, escapes at the end, or even if, the monster doesn't appear for a significant portion of the episode, or even if most of the episodes just Mulder and Scully camping together in the wilderness. It's still pretty amazing. I really, really love that episode.
Yeah, it's loads of fun. Mark O'Brien has quite a few thoughts. I confess, Mark, I'm not going to quite read them all because there's quite a lot, but thank you for everything you've put down. I'm going to cherry pick a little bit. He says, I love the end. It really did feel like the end, even though we knew all the movie was out that summer. Love that the episode follows on as a direct sequel to the end of The Red and the Black, with Krycek seeking out CSM. Take your shot, Alex! He quotes, which sort of sums up their whole relationship too, which is a good point. It was great to see full alien-believing Mulder back, which is why I never minded him as the bitter skeptic in Patient X, as I feel it was earned in getting him back to this point, even if he falls hook, line and sinker for CSM's chess game. Certainly think Mulder goes from skeptic to aliens to full on. Let's go full on Von Daniken into the alien astronaut theory. Yeah,
he's like the 5th season. There's no average setting. It's just either like Bad Blood or Schizogyny, or like Kill Switch or Emily. Like that's the 2 settings that you have on Mulder. It's like no, I'm an obnoxious asshole, or I'm an obnoxious asshole who believes in aliens. It's just like the dial. It's not so much a dial as a switch, really.
Yeah, definitely. R.W. Goodwin's direction is excellent, Mark says. Cinematic and tense in the last old Vancouver episode, and I feel his influence was really lost in later seasons in the production room. He always directed great cliffhangers. I think he's spot on there. I think it was a real shame that he didn't go with them, and I understand why. He lived in Canada, he was based there, he was married to Sheila Larkin, who's based there, but it is a shame. His contributions are sometimes not as well recognised as certain other people's, and we've said this before on the podcast, but he really always brought something to this show, so it's a shame.
I mean, it's more a credit to everybody who worked on the show that Goodwin was almost like the baseline level of quality, in that he was as good as he was. The show was almost consistently that good. It matched the standard that he set, and very few television shows could claim that. On any other television show, he'd be a giant. And I think that on The X-Files, Goodwin is the man who set the tone, the man who established what the show was capable of doing. And I think you're right that he is undervalued and is underappreciated. But I think that you look at the show as a whole, and his fingerprints are all over the best parts of it. And I think that's quite an accomplishment.
For sure, absolutely. All the interactions in the episode were great. Mark continues with Skinner asking Mulder at the start what he really hopes to find. A very honest question at this point of the series, and the interactions between Mulder and the shooter and Spender were great, with Spender doing a Luke Skywalker but going to the dark side instead. The last scene with the burning of the basement office in the X-Files was heartbreaking and also very cinematic, with 5 years' work appearing to be gone. And Mark's top 3, and you'll be glad of this, Darren, his number 1 is Patient X. His number 2 is Postmodern Prometheus. His number which shows just how differently people see that episode. His number 3 is Pine Bluff Variant, and his bottom 3 are number 1, surprise, surprise, Schizogyny, number 2, Emily, and number 3, Mind's Eye. So similar episodes coming up in the bottom 3, really, that we've seen.
I look, people like what they like. I'm very respectful of that. But ouch, what is with this kicking of Mind's Eye? I like Mind's Eye is great. Anyway, sorry, that's just me on a tangent.
I'm not going to say any more because you're not going to be very happy with me.
All right then. Next person who gives Postmodern Prometheus a high rating, I'm going to go take the gloves off and go straight to it. No, okay. The performances, the kind of the thematic dynamics of it. Anyway, never mind. Okay. Different tangent, different episode.
Well, let's get into that. What's your second worst episode of season 5?
Emily, and we've already kind of talked a great deal about it, so I probably won't talk too much about it again. I really like A Christmas Carol. I think A Christmas Carol is a beautiful episode. I think it's very thoughtful. It's very serene. I think, as you pointed out, like when I was younger, I had a similar reaction to it. I didn't think it was that fantastic, but as I've gotten older, A Christmas Carol's really grown on me as this very kind of mature story about looking back on your life and reflecting on where you are versus where you want to be. And I think that's amazing, which is why Emily is such a spectacular misfire of an episode. Its problems are manifold. You went through many of them, but just to single out what for me the biggest problems are that it's the point at which the show goes back to the Scully in hospital, Mulder do action stuff template once too often. And again, we talked about when we did Redux 1 and Redux 2, the show did this with Memento Mori in the 4th season. Anderson got an Emmy for it. The writing staff got an Emmy nomination for it. It's easy to see why the show felt the gravity of that pulling them towards it and why they felt the need to do it again. It doesn't excuse doing it 3 times in the space of a year, basically. And that's a problem, and it really hurts the episode. The other big problem is the sheer, emotional cynicism of we're going to give Scully a child, and then we're going to take the child away from her. But don't worry, it will never be mentioned again. But it's okay because it will make you feel bad while you're watching it, which is one of the most cynical and crass and vulgar things I've seen on a television show in quite some time, which makes you wonder what I could hate more than this episode. And then the final thing, just very, very briefly, that I really, really, really loathe about Emily, that I really despise, is the fact, and again, I feel sorry because I'm sure there are people who like Emily out there, and I'm really sorry that I'm being so mean about it. But the thing that I really personally dislike about Emily is that it takes the kind of story that One Breath was criticizing the second season, One Breath being one of my favorite episodes of The X-Files, one of my favorite episodes of television ever, and a spectacular piece of writing and direction and performance. And the beauty of One Breath was that it was a story that critiqued the kind of standard rape revenge narrative, the Virgin Spring, for example. But you mentioned even Charles Bronson in Death Wish, which is the kind of the victimized female character and the righteous male violence that you see in response to that. And One Breath was very much a rejection of that. It was like, well, no, actually Mulder learns that when Scully has something terrible happen to her, the most important thing that he can do for her is to be present and supportive of her. Not run around and pretend he's Charles Bronson. And then you have Emily, which tries to play the same sort of emotional beats in the 5th season and goes, actually, no, the best thing Mulder can do is throw people around offices and get into punching matches and prove how much of kind of an action hero he is while all this is going on. And I really, really, really profoundly dislike that. Anyway, sorry, that's my vent about Emily.
No, I agree, and I feel almost bad now for putting my second worst as Mind's Eye, because the way you've described Emily there is far worse than and Mind's Eye. I think I just find it really dull, and I think it's not so much that it's necessarily really bad, and I feel like it's one of those that I should watch more and try and understand, because Paige and Brooker, who did the episode on it not so long back, will defend it to the hilt, and they did a good job of pointing out all the good things about it. And Lily Taylor's performance is really good. There's no getting around that. But I find it ultimately very forgettable, and I just think it's not at the same caliber as a lot of these other episodes in the season.
And yet more kids killing parents stuff going on there. I mean, come on. I mean, seriously, the core of the season, baby. Go. Mind's Eye, the most important episode of the 5th season. That's all I'm saying here. I'm not actually saying that.
Yeah. So, doesn't really do it for me, but there you go. So, moving on, some more feedback. Chandru Ravindran. Now, again, Chandru has put loads down here, which is fantastic, so I'm going to cherry pick again. He says, I love the end, but it's very flawed. It's the most immaculately produced episode of The X-Files, aside from the more experimental episodes like Triangle. So that's a big claim there. Everything is momentous and grand, from the teaser in the stadium to Krychek literally parachuting down to capture CSM. Duchovny and Anderson are phenomenal here. You can feel their lives and beliefs teetering on the edge. It's intriguing to watch Krycek and CSM working together after all they've gone through, though I could do with about 3 fewer chess metaphors from CSM.
That's fair.
It feels like,
yeah,
it's fair, yeah. It feels like R.W. Goodwin took every lesson the crew learned in their 5 years and applied it into one of the slickest episodes ever. And that final sequence with Mulder and Scully watching their world burn in front of their eyes is extremely powerful, with one hell of a score. But yeah, he's got his top 3 best to worst, and his bottom 3 best to worst. So his top 3 are Redux 2 at number 1, which is really good. Bad Blood at number 2, and Folie à Deux at number 3, which has done well again. And his bottom 3, his number 1 is Travellers. Never mind. His number 2 is Chinga, and his number 3 is Schizogyny. So he's got a bit more of a mixed one there. It's nice to see Redux 2 get some love, actually, because the Redux trilogy is a lot of fun. So I quite like that he snuck that one in there.
Redux 1 was kind of vying for a place on my bottom 3, if we're being honest, which is more a testament to quality of the season than a condemnation of the episode in question. Like, I did have to actually struggle to come up with 3 that I think were really, really awful. But that's because I don't hate Mind's Eye, apparently. I don't hate Mind's Eye nearly enough. What's the big problem in putting together my list of the worst episodes of the season?
And it's always difficult when we do this, for sure. So let's stick with bottom ones then. So what would you say, before we do the top ones, we should finish on the top ones really, but what would you say your worst episode of season 5 is then, Darren?
All Souls. Neatly All Souls.
I really thought you were going to say Postmodern Prometheus.
No. Like, I mean, I have some issues with Postmodern Prometheus. I think it hasn't aged well. I think sexual politics are tone deaf in a way that the show is frequently tone deaf in some of its stuff. I mean, you know, it comes right after Unusual Suspects, which also has a prison rape joke, but I think it is also generally well-intentioned, surprisingly sweet, and a loving homage, and I think that it's hard to separate the two. It's a curate's egg of an episode for me. I don't hate it, I just can't bring myself to love it because there are parts of it that I have very serious problems with. And I don't begrudge anybody who does love it, to be absolutely clear. I don't think it's, I'm not going to get all righteous and angry and fire and brimstone about it. For me, it's hard for me to separate the parts of it that I really dislike from the parts of it that I really like. And therefore it kind of ends up sort of somewhere in the middle. And I kind of divorce that from it. So it would not make my bottom 3. It doesn't even come close, if we're being entirely honest. It ranks well above, say, Redux 1 in terms of episodes that were almost kind of on the list. But yeah, my absolute least favorite episode of the season is All Souls.
Yeah.
And I really, really dislike this episode, and I really fundamentally kind of irks me in a number of ways. You have this thing that the show does, and to be fair, it does it remarkably well in places. This idea of unquestioned faith, and the idea of unquestioned faith and religious devotion being something interesting and terrifying in equal measure. Like, I actually quite like Revelations in the 3rd season, to pick an example of an episode that kind of explores this. I think Sign and Wonders in the 7th season is fantastic because it deals with this discomfort kind of head on. This idea that faith is not something that makes you feel warm and comfortable. It should make you feel uncomfortable. And that's what, like, actual faith is, actual meaningful faith is something that you believe in despite the fact that it is actively hurtful or kind of contradictory to what you hold true, or what you know to be true in a rational sense. So I think the show kind of, like, over its run, balances this stuff reasonably well and takes it in interesting directions. My problem with All Souls is, well, first of all, structural, that the framing device is just horrific, but also that weird fixation on the idea that, you know, there's these disabled girls and God wants them to die. Which is just, I can't go with that. I can't go with the places where that wants to go, and I certainly can't go with leveraging that retroactively to try and justify the emotional torque that you pulled with Emily earlier on in the season. It feels like it kind of doubles down on the worst aspects of Emily, where it's like, actually what we're going to do is we're going to explain why it was a good thing that Scully's daughter died, so that you could feel sad about it and Gillian Anderson could cry about it, and we could maybe try and get an Emmy nomination. And what we're going to do is, instead of having her daughter die, her adorable kid daughter die, we're going to have a bunch of disabled young women die, and we're going to tell you that that's a good thing. And it doesn't sit with me well at all. It's really uncomfortable. It's really horrific. And I don't think my problem with the episode is not that it does this thing. It's that it does this thing so casually without understanding kind of like the connotations or actually unpacking what it's doing. Like, there's no sense. I mentioned Sign and Wonders as an episode about faith in the show that I quite like, because it goes into how faith can be unpleasant and how faith can drive people to do unpleasant things and how it can lead to suffering and anguish. And sometimes, for some people, that's what the value of faith is. With All Souls, there's never a sense of the writers kind of going, actually, this is horrific, is what this is. No, you're meant to go, at the end, you're meant to feel almost kind of enlightened or enlivened that these souls have been saved. That, you know, this force is at work in the world and divinity is moving through the world. And thank goodness these people are dead. And it's just, that's horrific. The episode is so tone deaf to me. It just, anyway, sorry, this is a very impassioned rant, but it really, really grates with me. I really, really, really profoundly dislike it.
To my shame, I think it's one of the episodes of the X-Files I remember the least. Maybe because I've blocked a lot of it out because it's really, but I've never liked it. I agree, and I think I don't very often have a desire to go back and watch that one, and it's an aberration within what is otherwise a really good season. My worst episode, I would say, or the one I enjoy the least, is probably Schizogyny. So we won't go over that because you articulated some of the issues with that well before. It's just, I just find it really, really, really boring. So again, quite often my, you know,
would you go so far as to say it's the root of all the problems with the season?
Very good.
Sorry, we're not really branching out here.
Yeah, I won't labour the point, but yeah, I just find it cripplingly dull. So that's my number one, really. So yeah, final little bits of feedback before we do our top episodes. Eleanor Butler says, I love the Foley Mulder Scully dynamic here. It's the culmination of the growing wedge between Mulder and Scully, which originated in the Redux episodes at the start. Think of everything Scully's been through this season: cancer, Emily, infertility, Cassandra and the Bridge, All Souls. I like the way she actually named the episode. Throughout most of this, Mulder has been at best vaguely sympathetic and at worst been a giant ass, as discussed in the podcast.
That's fair.
In every other season, Mulder is... Yeah, spot on. In every other season, Mulder has been open about his previous partners, yet here he's deliberately obtuse. Scully is particularly vulnerable here, and his secrecy hurts her deeply. This episode also follows from Pine Bluff, where again she's left in the cold. I don't see it as a romantic jealousy. It's more of an embodiment of her fear in Wetwired. Mulder isn't on her side, and he doesn't trust her. All she has left is the wreckage from her involvement with him, and she's devastated. I think that's a really good point there. I think she's hit on something, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think there is definitely kind of something there. I think that it is kind of interesting that it happens at the point where Mulder has been through his own kind of journey and has been kind of closed off to everything else that's happening around him. And he, like, again, Mulder, as pointed out, is not the most emotionally intelligent character at the best of times, like, to put it frankly, and that's why we love him. And it's very much like the show at various points, depending on who's writing it, is cognizant of that as a character fault to varying degrees. But I think that it is very much a kind of a consistent through line of his character arc. I think it maybe actually, to be fair, listening to that makes sense in the context of the fifth season. In terms of everything that he's been through, it makes sense that he would be particularly kind of closed off. And maybe even, to be honest, it kind of retroactively also makes sense of why he's such a jerk to Spender in this episode. Yeah. Because he's also, like, I mean, if Scully is getting ignored, overlooked, and kind of like being shut out, imagine how he's treating somebody he doesn't care about. Maybe actually makes a great deal of sense.
That's true. Yeah, it's good points. Eleanor's top three are Redux 2 at the top again, which is interesting. Detour at number 2, so we share that one. And Bad Blood at number 3. And bottom 3 are Travellers at number 1. Oh dear. Number 2, Unusual Suspects, which doesn't make bottom 3s very often. And number 3, Postmodern Prometheus. So again, an interesting mix, really, of different kind of viewpoints. Finally, final bit of feedback from Deana Ferreri. I really like the introduction of Diana Foley in the end, although I think the Foley-Scully dynamic devolves into a disappointing jealousy thing in season 6. Foley exposes the vulnerabilities in Mulder and Scully's relationship. As strong as their relationship is, it's not defined. There's no promise of exclusivity. How can you have a monogamous but non-sexual relationship? The idea that Mulder never mentioned Foley and the fact she's a believer, in quote marks, undermines Scully's perception of the strength of her partnership with Mulder, exposing it as fragile. And Gillian Anderson shows Scully's vulnerability beautifully. In the scene when Scully retreats to a car, my heart absolutely breaks for her. We've gone from my 1 in 5 billion to this in one episode. It's startling. It's very true. Yeah, she really contextualises that very well there, Deana, I think.
No, it's a good point.
I feel like there's a whole other podcast in this. I think this is one for a Patreon roundtable, I think, for sure. But yeah, Deana doesn't have any top threes or bottom threes, so let's do ours. So what would you say is your favourite episode, Darren, of season 5?
Bad Blood, easily and neatly, and probably one of my favourite episodes of the show in general, if we're being entirely honest. It's just a joy from beginning to end. It's one of those episodes that works remarkably well. Again, I mentioned that, Emily is probably the worst script that Gilligan worked on in his time in the show. Bad Blood is probably one of the best scripts that he worked on. I think Pusher is probably a little bit stronger, if we're being entirely honest, just in terms of function. But Bad Blood as a narrative construct is just amazing in terms of characterization, because you don't just end up with Mulder and Scully, accounting their version of events. You have them accounting their versions of each other and how those relate to one another. It's not just how they see each other, it's also how they see themselves, and the layering of kind of the script around that, where you have the little internal contradictions going on there. It's just so beautifully put together. It so wonderfully taps into the dynamic between the two, and the sense in which these two people who are so close to one another, who are, platonic life partners, or perhaps non-platonic life partners, depending on how you choose to look at it, but are basically the 1 in 5 billion, as mentioned, to each other in the world. How they are the closest people to one another, the people who most thoroughly understand one another in the world, and yet somehow don't. Somehow, despite all of that, this gulf exists between the two of them, trying to reconcile them. And it helps that the episode itself is built around this wonderful joke about vampires who have basically given up being vampires because, hell, it's the 90s and let's just move on a bit, which also just kind of adds this extra layer of kind of wonder, magic, and kind of playfulness and comedy to it. I really, really, really adore this episode.
You see, I've intentionally left it off my top 3 because I know that most people are going to put it high up or on their top 3. It is probably the best episode of season 5. I can't deny that. Everything you've said is spot on. It's brilliant. There's no getting away from that at all. But I've left it off my top 3 on purpose so I could get what is actually my favourite episode of season 5 in. And always has one of my favourite episodes. Well, do you know what? That would be in my top 5 because I love Kitsunagiri, as we talked about. But my favourite episode of season 5, one of my favourite episodes of the entire series, is the Pine Bluff variant. And that's my number 1.
And underappreciated as well. Like, it's come up a couple of times in the lists that we talked about this evening, but generally speaking, in terms of ranking the show's best episodes, I do feel like it's massively underrated. It is Shaban's best script, I would argue. I think it's comfortably, his best script.
Easily.
And it's so good. You could almost watch it by itself without the show. It's one of those great, if you want to show the X-Files to somebody who doesn't like the X-Files, but also want to show something that's representative of the X-Files, it's pretty much the perfect episode.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, actually. You're absolutely right, because it doesn't have a traditional story. It's not Mulder and Scully on a case. It's Mulder being really secretive, working secretly for the FBI, in undercover, in a terrorist group, but it's still layered with conspiracy, it's layered with drama, it's thrilling, it's exciting, it's weird, it's got some really haunting moments. It's just great. There's just so much to it that I love to bits, and I just watch it with a big grin on my face every single time. So it's my favorite episode, and I say it's one of the best of season 5 as well. I would put it up there, creatively and critically as well. It's a great follow on as well from Patient X and the Red and the Black, because it does tie into that in some way, in a certain way in terms of Mulder's motivations. So it's just really good. It's really, really good, and I love it to bits.
And it's notable that, like, when we've been talking about the season generally, like, almost we've had a radical divergence in terms of like people's top 3 episodes, and generally speaking, the consensus has been like, well, hey, that episode didn't make my top 3, but it would be in my top 5, or I think it's fantastic, or it's like, that's a fantastic season of television where there's no consensus 3 best episodes, but you can make an argument for just about any 3 from half or even 2/3 of the season, I would argue, maybe even 3/4 of the season, and make a convincing argument for those as the best episodes. That's a phenomenal season of television.
Entirely. I think season 5 is great. It really is one of the best seasons, I think, of the X-Files, and I think it's been great to talk through it. It's been great to go over it a little bit here, and thank you to all the contributors and guests who've been on the show across the run of season 5 episodes, because it's been really entertaining to listen to all those, including yourself, Darren, who's been on a bunch of them. So I really appreciate you joining me for the end, or the beginning, or the bit in the middle. The end of the beginning, who knows. So thanks for coming on the show.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. Always a delight. And thank you very much for everybody who's listening as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great. I think you're going to be back for our next step of the journey, which is, as we have previously announced on Twitter, the Fight the Future Minute, which we're doing. We're doing Fight the Future. We're not just going to do one podcast. We're going to do 117. So, Podwatch style, 15 to 20 minutes analysis of every single minute of the X-Files Fight the Future. And it is going to be brilliant. And we are quite a way into recording, and we've started editing. These will go live. Patrons will get them a couple of days earlier. So if you go to patreon.com/the Xcast, if you want in a little bit earlier on some of this stuff, then by all means join us. It'd be great to have you on board. But patrons will get it a couple of days earlier, and we're going to kick it off at the very beginning of May. So 1st of May, so not long to wait. And Fight the Future Minute will run all the way through to the middle of August. So you're going to get an Xcast a day for 3 or 4 months. And it's fairly, for various different reasons, it's going to be fairly good that you're going to get this many podcasts, because you might have a bit of free time this summer. So what better way to self-isolate than listen to a film about a killer virus on the loose, and I mean, outer space?
I think you could make the podcast go viral as well for that extra layer of self-awareness.
Well, there you go. So yeah, Darren, you're going to be chipping in on some of those episodes. We've got loads of the patrons around involved, and lots of guests and things like that. So it's going to be Podwatch style fun, I think. So I think people are really going to dig this in a big way. And we do have an extra little treat at the end, Fight the Future related. But I'm not going to tell anyone about that yet. That's something that we're still in the planning phase for. But it will be a nice capper on our Fight the Future coverage that I think you're going to love to bits. And Darren knows what I'm talking about now. He's in on it. He's in on the secret.
Do I?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I am.
Yes, you do.
I'm like the cigarette smoking man playing chess. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah,
I am not going to shoot any other contributor in the face, to be clear, just so we're drawing lines.
Yeah. But yeah, this isn't the announcement that I mentioned earlier, however. So I am going to tell you all something for the first time, that I am going to be the R.W. Goodwin of the Xcast, in that I'm not coming to LA. This is going to be my last episode as full host of the Xcast. Apart from Fight the Future Minute, which I will be involved with, and I'll be leading the charge on, and I'll be coming back and doing various different episodes. And we have a very special celebration episode for 5 years planned in September. And then after that, the podcast is going to chart a new course with new people running the show. And I'm going to take a step back to focus on running the network that we made, this podcast network, which the Xcast is part of, and various other different little bits of projects that are going on. And it feels the right time, I think, to do this now. We've gone 5 years nearly. The end is halfway through the X-Files, and we have an amazing group of people, and we're still working on who is going to shepherd the show going into the next era of the Xcast and the X-Files. But that's still being arranged, but it's pretty much going to happen that I won't really be involved in season 6, except for maybe one little thing.
I think I know which one little thing it might be.
So I am going to be around. I will be back on the show every now and then as a guest, but that will be my role now as a guest. So I will still have an overall look at the show. I'll still be helping out and things like this. I'll still be involved with the Patreon and the patrons and everything like that. But in terms of being the Chris Carter, I'm now more like Gene Roddenberry in season 3 of Star Trek. Just taking that's a reference that everyone will get, but just taking a step back.
I'm looking forward to the moment where I have to hawk the jewellery that you're selling via your mail order company. Just going to raise my hand and volunteer for that.
So yeah, that's the announcement, really. That it's not a full goodbye for me, and I'm still going to be around this year, but there will come a point where I sort of semi-part ways, but that's to come. That's to come. This will be my final full episode as host of one of the episodes.
I should be very clear to listeners. I did not know this was coming. I would have been much kinder to the postmodern Prometheus if I did know it was coming. But no, more seriously though, thank you, Tony. And I think I speak for everybody listening to this podcast because I know it's the first reaction I had. But just to say thank you for everything you've done, and you brought together a wonderful group of people. It's a fantastic podcast, very, very, very talented, very intelligent bunch of commenters, and somehow myself having weaseled my way in there. But no, it really is. It's a wonderful network, and I'm not talking about the podcast network. I'm talking about the people, a wonderful group of people that you brought together, and it's a joy. And for me personally, it's a huge thrill to be part of this. I imagine I'm far from the only person to think that. And I imagine a lot of listeners feel the same way. So thank you very, very much. I unfortunately do not have any roses or a bouquet of roses that I can hand to you from off stage. But I'm also told that would also be inappropriate in this era of social distancing. So that's the excuse I'm going to use for not having it to hand. But no, more seriously, thank you so much, Tony. We really, really appreciate it. I didn't know this was coming. I would have had something more profound to say, but it really, really does mean a lot, everything that you've done. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Darren, and I'm sorry I've thrown you for a surprise really. But this is purely a decision based on the fact that I've kind of been sort of taking a step back for a couple of seasons now. You know, I wasn't really involved much in actual recording of season 4. I've done a little bit more for season 5, so it doesn't feel like it's too great, a shift. And I think the people that I'm hoping will steer the show forward will be people you know and trust, and you've probably got an idea of who the kind of people that I'm going to try and get involved in this a little bit more and steer the ship. So you'll be in great hands. And this is now a team thing. I've said this before on the podcast. The Xcast long ago outgrew me, and it is a team effort that will carry on with super excited and devoted X-Files fans, of which I am still one. You know, it's still my favourite show in the world, and I will absolutely appear on the Xcast again. But it might not be for a while after we do the celebration episode in September after Fight the Future Minute. So
what you're saying is we should really look forward to Xcast 2020 hosted by Chris Owens, finally getting his time to shine.
Well, he has been on the show before, so you know it's anything's possible, guys. Anything's possible, and no one ever dies in the X-Files, or no one ever stops hosting the Xcast. So I'm sure I'll be back. But as ever, you can catch me at AJ Blackwriter on Twitter if you want to ask me some questions about this or know more or find out what I'm doing. More importantly, Darren, what are you doing? Where can people find you, and what are you up to with all your various different fantastic projects?
Well, luckily enough, I'm in one place for the foreseeable future. So you can find me in the north of County Dublin, where I won't be going anywhere for a very long time. But no, more seriously, if you're looking for me online, available in multiple places. I write for the Movie Blog with a 0 instead of an O. I also write for the Escapist magazine, where I do a couple of columns every week as well. So if you want to pop over and say hi to those, I'd really, really appreciate those. I also host a podcast with my friend Andrew Quinn called The 250. Tony's been a guest on it before. We basically go through the IMDb's top 250 and bottom 100 movies of all time, one at a time, one a week. So we've got, I think, 175 episodes in the can. Keep in mind that one of those episodes is 18 hours long. So it's kind of, 175 is quite a lot. If you want to go back, have a look through those. Maybe if you are watching movies, it might be a nice companion piece. If you are looking for something to kind of keep you company in this kind of era of social isolation, if you want two people talking at you through your earphones, it's a nice way to do that. If you want to listen to what we're doing currently, the weekend that we're recording this, we'll be releasing an episode on Birdemic, because we feel like it's very topical, this story of exploding birds and viral pandemics. But we'll be releasing that episode this weekend. The weekend after, we're actually moving, because listeners may be self-quarantining, self-isolating because travel's become a lot more difficult, and because, you know, people are feeling perhaps a bit quarantined, a bit claustrophobic, what we thought we'd do on the podcast is we would try to bring the world to you. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a season of international films, and international films that we are hoping will be readily available to listeners. So the week after this, we'll be doing The Invisible Guest, which is available worldwide on Netflix. It's known as Contratiempo. It's a Spanish film. It's basically a Hitchcock homage. So we'll be discussing that with the wonderful Anya O'Connor from the Sunday Independent. The week after that, we'll be doing one of my personal favourite movies of all time, which is Infernal Affairs, which is the movie that inspired The Departed. It's in Hong Kong. It is available to stream online via sort of Netflix if you're in the UK and Ireland, but any other provider if you're worldwide as well. And then in the coming weeks, we'll be doing some Studio Ghibli movies because they're all available now through Netflix, and they'll also be available via Movies Anywhere and other online platforms as well if you want to use them, and possibly even Gangs of Wasseypur as well. So we're going to try and do something to bring the world to your earbuds. If you can't go out into the world can come to you, is what we're hopefully going to try and do over the next coming weeks.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you are quarantined or you are self-isolating, there's going to be plenty of time to check all that stuff out, guys. So absolutely get on it and do it. And yeah, we will be back for some special episodes. We have an interview with Gibson Praise himself, Jeff Gorka, which is going to come very soon as well. So keep your ears out for that one. We'll have some more Patreon roundtables coming, and then of course we've got Fight the Future Minute. So it's going to be a packed, exciting X-Files based summer. So yeah, absolutely check it out. Remember as well to check out the podcast network at We Made This Pod, and the website wemadethispod.com for far more podcasts as part of the network. We're going to give you a little sneak peek of some of those coming up right now, but it's time for me to say, not for the last time, because this isn't quite the end. Trust no one. Previously on the We Made This Network. You Won't Forget Me.
This film is often, and rightly regarded, as one of Joan's best. Here she gives a performance, under the guidance of Q-Core and with the support of worthy co-stars Douglas and Veet, that shows her very soul. Her eyes are like luminous liquid windows to her heart. There is no glamour here. It is all about the story, about Anna Holm and her need to remove herself from a past that has been one solid mass of black.
Make It So, a Star Trek Picard podcast.
I do think the gap between Frakes and Riker probably isn't that huge either.
Yeah,
is it not
I
things
agree.
like the love of jazz and stuff was all him? Various things that he brings into the character. The love of cooking must be him. You know,
Yes.
and it's something that he brought into Riker, especially later on. You know, is the controversial Enterprise final episode. He took on the role of the chef, so he got to do some food prep, and this is what he spends a lot of this episode doing as well, which I thought was hilarious. It's, the last time we saw him, he was making food, and now he's doing it again. This is what Riker does now. You know, and I feel like that might be a Frakes thing.
Yeah, probably. The Giddy Carousel of Pop.
Before we clamber aboard the carousel, Hannah, could you tell us a bit about why you chose this particular issue? What jumped out when you were looking through and deciding which one to choose?
Well, there were two main things. Chris and Neil. No, the Pet Shop Boys cover, I absolutely loved it with the sailor hats. And it was, of course, Neil Tennant that made me want to work on Smash Hits. I went in and told my teachers that I wanted to go and be deputy editor like him. And they said, don't be so stupid, just go into teaching. It's never going to happen. But fortunately, I ignored them, so that's good. But the other thing, I can remember getting this issue so clearly. The other thing was there's an interview with Michael Hutchence, the most beautiful man that ever lived. And the one-page poster, it's just exquisite. He's all curly hair and smouldering sums. He's, it's just amazing. To see him in there, it was like, oh, who's this? What's going on?
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.